A parched and forbidding wasteland to those who've journeyed through it over the years, the western Mojave is a harsh, inhospitable land of sometimes stunning contrasts. A land of bone-chilling nights and griddle-hot days, of violent dust storms and mesmerizing sunsets. The primitive landscape is dominated by one truly remarkable feature. When she first gazed upon it early in this century, homesteader Jeanette Darr said of it, "I thought it was the jumping-off place of creation, that curiously flat wasteland called Dry Lake." Many years later, however, aviation pioneer General Albert Boyd would call it God's gift to the Air Force. First formed in the Pleistocene epoch, Rogers Dry Lake is one of nature's most unique creations. The flattest and hardest of all natural landforms, its parched clay and silt surface undergoes a timeless cycle of renewal each year, as water from winter storms is swept back and forth by desert winds, smoothing it out to an almost glass-like flatness. Spreading out over 65 square miles, it is the largest geological formation of its kind in the world. The open spaces of the high desert, its isolation, arid climate, the clear blue skies overhead, and, most importantly, the vast expanse of lakebed, were what caught the attention of then Lieutenant Colonel Hap Arnold when in 1933 he was looking about for a bombing and gunnery range for his Marchfield squadrons. Where others had seen a curiously flat wasteland, Hap Arnold saw a natural airfield. In September of that year, a small contingent of troops arrived at the spot then called Muroc, and laid out a bombing and gunnery range along the east shore of the lakebed. For the troops who comprised the Muroc Range Maintenance Detachment throughout the 30s, the place had little to offer. Theirs would be a tough, hardscrabble existence, life in a primitive tent camp community, long days of backbreaking work, with few of the conveniences of civilization, and even fewer diversions to relieve the tedium of their daily routines. Their isolation seemed so complete, in fact, that among locals it came to be known as the Foreign Legion of the Army Air Corps. Their lonely exile was periodically interrupted, however, as flying units came in for training exercises. Among the first to arrive was a young captain named Ira Aker, commander of the 95th Pursuit Squadron, and, a decade later, the entire 8th Air Force. He was followed by countless others, as the remote bombing and gunnery range more than lived up to Hap Arnold's expectations. Indeed, by 1941, Muroc had become a regular stop for the men who'd guide American air power through the perilous times ahead. By that time, though most of the range maintenance detachments still lived in tents, a new, more permanent facility was rising up across the lake there. And while training exercises proceeded, there were other activities taking place almost unnoticed, which were harbingers of things to come. John Northup had been flight testing his M1M Jeep, his first true flying wing, at Muroc since 1940. By the late fall of 1941, a primitive sled track had been built on the lakebed, where small, remotely controlled aircraft were being ground tested. Not far away, an exotic-looking, semi-tailless airplane was undergoing taxi tests. The airplane was the Curtiss Wright CW-24B, a full-scale wood and fabric flying mock-up for a proposed interceptor. Now all but forgotten, the CW-24B lifted off from the parched surface of the lakebed for the first time on December 2, 1941, thereby becoming the first of more than 100 airplanes that would complete their maiden flights at this out-of-the-way place on the high deserts. 5 days later, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and Muroc suddenly erupted with activity as troops and flying units from all over the country hastily assembled there. Barracks, hangars, mess halls, and other facilities, marvels of tar paper wire and wood, as one of the troops called them, went up almost overnight on what became known as South Base. And in July of 1942, Muroc Army Air Base finally became a separate post. Its primary mission was to provide final combat training for fighter and bomber crews, And throughout the war years, thousands of young men would pass through it just prior to overseas deployment. It was at Muroc in 1942, for example, that Lieutenant Colonel Curtis LeMay first assembled and trained his famed 305th Bomb Group, molding it into a legendary fighting unit which set new standards for effectiveness in the mighty 8th Air Force. And it was to Muroc late in the war that by then Major General LeMay would send the cream of his 21st Air Force for B-29 lead crew training as they prepared for the final assault on Japan. It was at Muroc these crews perfected their ability to navigate over vast distances and employ their bombing equipment with the kind of pinpoint accuracy which would have such a decisive impact on the outcome of the Pacific War. A much different type of mission had gotten underway at a restricted area just 6 miles to the north. There, at a top-secret test site, the crated pieces of a radically new type of aircraft were unloaded from boxcars on September 19, 1942, and over the next 10 days it was hastily assembled. The airplane was the Bell XP-59A Era Comet, and on October 2nd, Bell test pilot Bob Stanley launched America into the jet age as he lifted off from the lakebed. Testing continued over the next 2 years, and though the P-59 disappointingly lacked the performance of the best prop-driven fighters of the day, it nevertheless represented a start, the first of a long series of airplanes that would make the high desert base synonymous with the turbojet revolution in America. Indeed, the availability of the enormous lakebed made it almost inevitable. The development of the turbojet engine introduced a host of new problems. The new power plants were woefully underpowered, and thus the new jets required exceptionally long takeoff rolls. More critically still, the temperamental engines flamed out, and if pilots couldn't recover from engine stalls, their only hope was close proximity to a spacious airfield where they could attempt dead-stick landings. With miles and miles of available runways extending in every direction, the lakebed offered the most spacious landing field in the world. Throughout the decades ahead, it would be a welcome haven for countless pilots in distress. Thus, while the major training mission continued throughout the war, a growing number of aircraft, conventional airplanes such as the P-38 Lightning and the Lockheed Constellation, unconventional prototypes such as Northrop's XP-56 Black Bullet, purely experimental aircraft such as the N-9M, and the rocket-powered MX-324, had even captured enemy aircraft such as the ME-163 Comet and the HE-162 Volksjäger, were also undergoing flight test evaluations at the rapidly expanding North Base facility. In January of 1944, a major milestone occurred when a new Lockheed jet-powered prototype, the XP-80, lifted off for its maiden flight. Demonstrating the truly remarkable advances that had been made in little more than a year since the XP-59's first flight, this impressive airplane was the prototype for America's first combat-worthy jet fighter, the P-80 Shooting Star. Where the P-59 had been outperformed by prop-driven fighters, the P-80 demonstrated in tests at Muroc that it could successfully attack bomber formations even when outnumbered 6-1 by the very best of the conventional fighters, and it convinced everyone that the Air Force would have to undergo a rapid transition into jet propulsion. The remarkable potential of that transition was underscored in June of 1947, when Colonel Albert Boyd returned the world speed record to America for the first time in 24 years, as he sped to more than 623 miles per hour over a course above the lakebed in a modified P-80R. It was the first of some 14 world speed records that would be set at the base over the next 18 years. But Boyd and other Air Force officials had set their sights much higher than speed records. As he stood proudly on the ramp that day, he'd already made a decision which would dramatically alter the future course of aviation and indeed aerospace history. For he'd chosen the pilot and test crew who challenged the so-called and much dreaded sound barrier. The X-1 program was the first in a long series of X or experimental programs that were designed to prove or disprove concepts, to probe the most challenging unknowns of flight and solve their mysteries. It was conceived in response to a new and terrifying phenomenon which fighter pilots had first encountered during the recent war. Pushing over into steep dives, they found themselves at speeds of 500 miles per hour and into the unknown region of transonic flight, where the effects of compressibility, loss of control, and structurally devastating aerodynamic loads began to take over with often deadly consequences. The new jet engines promised even higher speeds passing through the transonic and even perhaps into the supersonic region. The critical question was, could a piloted airplane be designed and built which could survive in it? The aircraft designed to make the assault was the bullet-shaped, rocket-powered Bell X-1, and the man who would try to fly it through the sonic wall was a young Air Force captain named Chuck Yeager. Assisted by a team from Bell and the NACA, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, he and project engineer Captain Jackie Ridley had a lot on their minds as Yeager edged his way cautiously toward Mach 1 throughout the fall of 1947. Military test pilots at that time didn't get many opportunities to fly such hazardous, experimental programs. Thus he felt he had a lot to prove as the B-29 lifted off for his 9th powered flight on the morning of October 14th. He'd already flown out to Mach 0.997, just a hair's breadth away from the sonic wall, and yet what lay ahead was still a mystery, and there were still many who thought that what he was attempting was tantamount to suicide. At 20,000 feet, the X-1 was released. Igniting the chambers of his rocket engine, Yeager began to climb. Then, at 43,000 feet, the X-1 shot through the sound barrier and remained supersonic for about 20 seconds. The sharp double crack of his sonic boom that morning signaled the dawn of a remarkable era during which a high desert outpost called Muroc would become identified with the most daring concepts in aviation. And it triggered a series of events which would ultimately vault man beyond the atmosphere and into space. But first, the remarkable potential of the turbojet engine had to be realized, and there were perplexing challenges to be overcome before that could happen. Not only were the early engines underpowered, they also consumed enormous quantities of fuel, and this severely limited range capability. Turboprops offered an attractive alternative, but the XP-81's performance simply couldn't match that promised by pure jet configurations. The XF-85 embodied the so-called parasite concept. Designed to be carried in the bomb bay of a heavy bomber, it would be carried deep into enemy territory, released, chase off enemy interceptors, and then return and hook up with the mother ship. On the first hookup attempt, however, the test pilot was nearly decapitated. And though a successful hookup was ultimately accomplished, the idea wasn't really practical. Another solution was to build big fighters, which could carry vast quantities of fuel. But this was a self-defeating solution, producing increased weight and drag, which imposed unacceptable performance penalties. Thus, most of the long procession of fighter prototypes that were put through their paces at Muroc during the post-war years represented little more than transitional designs, as engine designers tried to build more powerful and fuel-efficient engines, and aircraft designers struggled to develop airframes that could optimize their potential. Most of the new prototypes were overweight, underpowered, and during a time of dramatic technological breakthroughs, already obsolete compared to new designs then coming off the drawing boards. The North American XF-86 was by far the most successful of these transitional designs. The first American jet to employ swept wings to delay the onset of compressibility and enhance high-speed maneuverability. It was already diving to supersonic speeds just 6 months after it first flew in October of 1947. And it went on to enjoy a better than 10-to-1 kill ratio against enemy fighters in hostile skies over Korea. Post-war bomber development ran into many of the same problems encountered by the fighter programs. Most of the new prototype bombers on the ramp at Muroc represented early attempts to blend the new turbojet technology with conventional aerodynamic designs. In fact, America's first jet bomber, the Douglas XB-43, resulted from a simple, straightforward modification of the piston-engined XB-42. Graceful and streamlined, the XB-46 was already considered obsolete when it arrived at Muroc at the end of its first flight in April of 1947. And the robust B-45, though it went into operational service, was, from the very outset, never intended to serve as anything more than an interim bomber. As with the fighters, first true advance came with the introduction of swept wings on Boeing's B-47. Capable of speeds in excess of 600 miles per hour, this airplane was developed into the thoroughbred of the Air Force's post-war bomber fleet. The most radical design by far, however, was Northrop's Mammoth flying wing. Originally designed with a complicated system of pusher props and designated the XB-35, it was ultimately reconfigured with jets and transformed into the majestic YB-49. The culmination of Northrop's attempts to build a pure flying wing, it represented a bold leap into the future, which those who saw it knifing its way through the skies over Muroc would never forget. One of its test pilots was a young Californian named Captain Glenn Edwards. Along with Major Dan Forbes, he was flying one of the prototypes in June of 1948 when it broke apart in the sky northwest of the base. All 5 crew members were lost. In December of 1949, Muroc Air Force Base was renamed in honor of the young test pilot. As the base entered the 50s, the tempo increased dramatically. A wide variety of new types and models of aircraft appeared on the flight line every year, as Edwards became known as the place where the rubber meets the ramp. It had long since become the de facto center of American flight research, and in June of 1951, that status was finally recognized officially as the base was designated the U.S. Air Force Flight Test Center, and a $120 million master plan was implemented to build an entirely new main base complex north of the existing facility. But the mission went far beyond flight testing. At the north end of the lakebed, tests were being run on a 2,000-foot deceleration track, where Colonel John Stapp and his team of aeromedical researchers were studying the human body's tolerance for G-forces and developing safety equipment that would save countless lives. Using himself as a test subject, Stapp ultimately proved that when properly restrained, the human body is amazingly resilient, as he went on to survive a 45G deceleration. The world's fastest railroad was in operation at the south end of the lakebed, likened to an outdoor wind tunnel because everything, airfoils and aerodynamic shapes to ejection systems and other aircraft components, could be tested in real-world conditions. The 10,000-foot high-speed sled track permitted speeds of more than 1,500 miles per hour. While the rocket sleds blistered across the flatlands below, another, much different enterprise was getting underway, high on a granite ridge overlooking the lakebed. At the Air Force's captive missile test site, the ground quaked to the massive roar of the rocket engines that would begin to launch America into the space age. Back in the 30s and 40s, men had come to Muroc to train for combat. In the early 50s, they started coming to train as test pilots. By the time the Air Force's Experimental Test Pilot School moved from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to Edwards in 1951, the role of the test pilot had undergone a radical change from the pre-jet era. The job had always required exceptional precision flying skills, keen powers of observation, coolness under pressure, and the ability to fly a mission exactly as planned. But the young pilots of the 50s faced a much more complex situation. The arrival of the jet engine, along with an incredible proliferation of onboard systems, had greatly magnified the difficulties inherent in the job. In addition to new problems of stability and control, the high-speed envelope left a much smaller margin for error. The amount of time in which to make critical decisions was dramatically compressed, and the ever-increasing complexity of the aircraft gave test pilots a lot more to think about. Thus, in addition to exceptional flying skills, applicants to the school now had to have solid engineering backgrounds. And once they entered, they were subjected to an increasingly rigorous academic curriculum before they got the opportunity to learn the intricacies of performance testing, where they had to learn to control airspeed to the nearest knot and hold their altitude at extraordinarily precise levels, to define how far, how fast, and how efficiently an airplane could fly. They went on to learn how to evaluate the subtle nuances of aircraft stability and control, and the often breathtaking intangibles of spin testing, where they had to learn the art of dispassionate data collection while gyrating and plummeting toward an onrushing lakebed. There was no dearth of qualified applicants, because by the early 50s, a whole mystique had grown up about Edwards. It had become a mecca for the very best. Men like Yeager, Tony LeVere, Bob Hoover, Bill Bridgman, Scott Crossfield, Pete Everest, and Fitz Fulton. In an age fascinated by higher, faster, farther, these men won worldwide acclaim. A great many others, who also, day after day, rode on the cutting edge of calamity, didn't. But they came nevertheless, because if it was new, if it was fast, if it was unconventional, it was at Edwards, and it was there that they could pit their skills against the very best among their peers. Then as now, test pilots were intensely competitive. If not always cocky, they were supremely self-confident. They had to be. And they were courageous. They were also disciplined and cautious, always methodically calculating the odds. They were not careless. They couldn't afford to be. There wasn't any margin for error in their business. Knowledge and careful preparation were survival tools. The popular image of the devil-may-care test pilot, raising hell all night and breaking records the next morning, was largely a fiction of tabloid journalism. As Chuck Yeager once so aptly put it,
"You can't hoot with the owls all night and fly with the eagles all day. It just don't work that way."
But competitive? Yes. By late 1953, the NACA's Scott Crossfield had already taken the Navy's D-558 Phase II Douglas skyrocket out to Mach 1.96. Pretty good for an airplane which hadn't been designed to fly that fast. But he wanted that next magic number, Mach 2, and he knew that just down the flight line, Yeager was preparing to fly the X-1A, which had been designed to easily exceed that speed. On November 20th, he went up knowing it would be his last chance, and flying an extraordinarily precise profile, he was able to hit Mach 2.005 in a shallow dive. 3 weeks later, Yeager went up intending to obliterate his rival's new record. And indeed he did. But shortly after hitting Mach 2.44, 1,650 miles per hour, he encountered something terrifyingly new as the X-1A tumbled violently out of control. It was called inertial coupling. The X-1A was literally spinning about all three of its axes. Somehow, after tumbling downward wildly for more than 40,000 feet, he recovered to level flight, and with superb flying skill, brought the airplane back to fly another day. And just 8 months later, Major Kit Murray flew it up above 90,000 feet. Their records would stand for less than 3 years. By July of 1956, Lieutenant Colonel Pete Everest had flown the Bell X-2 all the way out to Mach 2.87, where he began to encounter the effects of aerodynamic heating. But he warned of serious stability problems at that speed. Then, in early September, Captain Ivan Kinchlow claimed a new altitude mark as he climbed above 126,000 feet. 3 weeks later, on his first flight in a rocket airplane, Captain Mel App took it up for an assault on Mach 3. He sped to Mach 3.2 that day, more than 2,000 miles per hour, and became the fastest man alive, but only for brief moments. Shortly after hitting top speed, the X-2 spun violently out of control. Bitten, like Yeager, by inertial coupling, App struggled gamely to recover the craft. His efforts were in vain. Mach 3 had been conquered, but at a terrible price. Not all of the research involved rocket planes. The Air Force, along with the NACA, conducted a whole series of programs with exotic research vehicles. The XF-92A demonstrated the feasibility of the delta wing and introduced pilots to the touchiness of hydraulically boosted, irreversible flight controls. The needle-nose X-3 flying stiletto was ultimately used to explore the problem of high-speed instability. The X-4 Bantam to study the transonic flying qualities of a swept-wing, semi-tailless design. The X-5 demonstrated the performance advantages to be gained by sweeping the wings forward and aft in flight, a concept that would later bear fruit in the design of several frontline combat aircraft. And the unmanned Mach 2 X-10 laid the foundation for remote control of a variety of high-performance air vehicles. Runway vulnerability had long been a major concern. Project Zelmo, for zero-length launch and matte landing, was one of the solutions posed to deal with it. The Zell part proved feasible. Strap a rocket booster on the belly of an F-84, ignite it, and 2.5 seconds later, you're safely airborne. But the Mal part proved just a little more difficult. Zelmo was not the answer. What was needed were true VTOL, or vertical takeoff and landing airplanes. Powered by counter-rotating props, the XF-V1 was supposed to take off or land vertically and transition to conventional flight. Though capable of in-flight transitions, it never achieved either a vertical takeoff or landing. But the jet-powered X-13 Vertijet successfully demonstrated both. And by proving that VTOL flight was possible on jet thrust alone, it opened up a whole new arena of flight. All of the esoteric data from the research programs was applied to the development of new operational designs, and the 50s finally saw the culmination of the turbojet revolution with the development of aircraft which embodied a mature blending of efficient turbojet propulsion and streamlined aerodynamic design. This was nowhere more evident than with the arrival of the famous Century series of truly supersonic fighters. The F-100 Super Sabre, the F-101 Voodoo, the 102 Delta Dagger, the Mach 2 F-104 Starfighter, F-105 Thunder Chief, later known more simply as the Thud, F-106 Delta Dart, hailed as the ultimate interceptor, and the F-107 Ultra Sabre, the only Century fighter not to go into operational service. These truly spectacular airplanes defined the basic speed and altitude envelopes for fighters for the rest of the century. And yet each of them also arrived at Edwards with critical flaws, which required years of patient effort to eliminate. But of course, that's always been the purpose of flight testing. High-performance fighters were only part of the story. Test pilots and engineers refined the capabilities of everything, from a new turboprop heavy freighter, the C-133, to the extremely agile and versatile C-130, a classic design which would become the model for tactical transports. And the first jet-powered tanker, KC-135, which would remain in service until well into the next century, as well as a new, truly intercontinental strategic bomber, the YB-52, which would provide the safety net of nuclear deterrence for more than a generation. And by the end of the decade, the sleek B-58 Hustler, the delta-wing bomber, which would establish some speed and time-to-climb records which still have yet to be broken. As the 60s opened, a group of pilots were undergoing zero-G and other types of training at Edwards. They'd go on to win celebrity status as the Mercury astronauts. They were the first of 3 groups of astronauts whose exploits would remain front-page news as they were catapulted into space in cone-shaped capsules. But there was another group of pilots at Edwards who would make the journey by much different means, in a rocket-powered airplane, the North American X-15. As the decade opened, Scott Crossfield, who had helped design the airplane, was completing its flight worthiness demonstration in preparation for the combined Air Force, NASA, and Navy program, which would probe the unknowns of hypersonic and near-space flight. Then, within the brief span of 8 months in 1961, the X-15's awesome potential was finally unleashed, as it became the first aircraft to exceed Mach 4, 5, and 6. The pilot who made each of those flights, Major Robert M. White, was also the first to fly it in space, as he climbed above 300,000 feet the following year. And in August of 1963, NASA's Joe Walker took it all the way up to 354,000 feet, 67 miles above the Earth's surface, a record which still stands. 12 men flew the X-15. 8 of them became astronauts by flying an airplane through space. And one of them would go on to become the first man to set foot on the moon. But the program wasn't free of incident. In November of 1962, for example, NASA's Jack McKay lost power shortly after launch and was forced to attempt an emergency landing on Mud Lake in Nevada with nearly full fuel tanks and without landing flaps. At touchdown, the left gear failed. McKay survived the incident, but the airplane looked like a total loss. It was resurrected, however, as the X-15A2, and with a pair of jettisonable external fuel tanks to enable it to reach for higher speeds, and covered with a thermal protection coating to protect it from the 2,000-degree heat expected at those speeds. Major Pete Knight took it all the way out to Mach 6.7, 4,520 miles per hour, one day in October of 1967. But at a speed more than twice that of a .50 caliber bullet, the thermal protection failed, permitting torch-like hypersonic air to incinerate parts of the ventral tail. And only by dint of his exceptional piloting skills was he able to bring it safely back. Charred by its wild ride through the inferno of re-entry, it would never fly again. And Pete Knight's record still remains the highest speed at which any man has ever flown in an airplane. As the pace of the space program gained momentum, there were all kinds of related activities at Edwards. At the NASA facility, for instance, they were testing an ungainly-looking machine, which symbolized one of man's greatest aspirations, the Lunar Landing Research Vehicle. And at the Test Pilot School, renamed the Aerospace Research Pilot School, students were now introduced to such arcane subjects as thermodynamics, orbital mechanics, and bioastronautics, and given training in a wide variety of machines designed to simulate various spaceflight conditions. The training they received served them well, and a great many of them, like Jim McDivitt, Frank Borman, and Michael Collins, would go on to make their marks in space. Spaceflight captured the nation's imagination, but the Flight Test Center was still in business to evaluate airplanes. A new supersonic trainer, the T-38 Talon. A rugged new fighter, the F-4 Phantom II, which went on to become a mainstay of the Tactical Air Command. A pair of new transports, the C-141 Starlifter, and its big brother, the gargantuan C-5A Galaxy. And a new Mach 2 fighter bomber, the swing-winged F-111. While those who tested these airplanes didn't get much publicity, their work could be every bit as thrilling as a Mach 5 re-entry in the X-15.
Okay, it's spinning. That's a spin. Okay, it's a spin. Yeah. Okay, now go ahead. It looks like a standard right. Yeah. Opposite rudder. Full rudder. Reporting some of the full. Okay. Wait a minute. Keep the stick forward. Stick forward.
44.
Going back into the spin, I think.
Yeah, I think it is. All right, 42, deploy the spin chute.
Now it's covered. You got it. Deploy
spin chute.
The spin chute came off. Chute came off.
18 down.
You got it. Chute failed. You got it.
16.
Get out, Pete.
14. Eject.
There were a pair of aircraft whose incredibly advanced capabilities still dazzled the imagination. The mammoth 500,000-pound XB-70 Valkyrie was almost routine, flown at Mach 3 speeds and altitudes of 70,000 feet. More impressive still was the mysterious YF-12 Blackbird. Predecessor of the legendary SR-71, this remarkable airplane was able to cruise for extended periods at speeds in excess of Mach 3 and at altitudes somewhere above 80,000 feet. On a single day at Edwards in May of 1965, it set no less than 9 world speed and altitude records without in any way taxing its full potential. While some pilots cruised along at better than 2,000 miles per hour, others explored the concept of laminar flow control, the elimination of drag-inducing boundary layer turbulence over the wings of the X-21A. And still others continued to study VTOL flight. The experimental X-18 tilt-wing aircraft spawned the much more ambitious XC-142. Pilots could transition its entire wing and engine assembly to the vertical for takeoff, and then to the horizontal for conventional flight. Though a feasible concept, the future still seemed to lie with jet thrust, and the XB-5 employed that thrust to drive counter-rotating fans within its wings to create vertical lift. More radical still, the XB-6A Kestrel relied upon vector thrust, provided by its powerful turbofan engine and channeled through rotating nozzles. The technology so ably demonstrated by this experimental airplane would be applied directly to the design of the successful Harrier and AV-8 combat aircraft of today. It was called the Flying Bathtub. Fabricated from steel tubing and plywood, the M2F-1 was the first in a series of curious-looking, wingless craft that descended to landings on Rogers Dry Lake from the mid-60s through the early 70s. They were called lifting bodies, and subsequent designs, such as the M2F2, HL-10, X-24A, and X-24B, were all metal and rocket-powered. They were used to determine whether or not, through the use of energy management techniques, these low lift-to-drag shapes could make precision landings after high-speed, unpowered, gliding descents from high altitudes. The descents in these craft, NASA's Milt Thompson noted, were so rapid that the lakebed rushes up towards you like a straight arm from a fullback. Nevertheless, they demonstrated that they could indeed make precision landings, even on concrete runways, with remarkable touchdown accuracies. And in doing so, they made a signal contribution to the American space effort because they validated the approach and landing techniques that would later be employed by the first true spaceships, the Space Shuttle. Edwards witnessed the beginning of a new revolution during the 70s, whereas in the past, the emphasis had been on making airplanes fly faster and higher. Now it was on making them fly more efficiently. A wide array of new aerodynamic concepts and sophisticated systems based on high-speed computers made this possible. In the early 70s, NASA modified an F-8 Crusader to explore a new aerodynamic concept, the supercritical wing. Flattened on top and tapering downward at the trailing edge, the thin wing promised enormous performance advantages, permitting jetliners to increase their speeds while burning less fuel. The success of this program gave rise to the NASA Air Force F-111 Transonic Aircraft program, in which the concept was explored for possible military applications. The advent of compact, high-speed digital computers enabled NASA to explore the potential of fly-by-wire flight controls on another modified F-8. In addition to their speed and light weight, constantly active controls combined with electronic sensors could provide artificial stability, and thus relieve designers of the burden of having to build inherently stable aircraft, and focus instead on peak performance and agility. The Air Force went on to pursue the logic of the electronics revolution with the Digitac A-7 aircraft, which provided the pilot with selectable control modes, each of them tailored to optimize the craft's tracking and handling qualities for a specific weapons delivery task, such as bombing, or air-to-air, or air-to-ground gunnery. The advantages conferred by these and other new technologies were quickly applied to new operational designs. The YF-16 Fighting Falcon, for example, was the first to employ digital fly-by-wire, which permitted it to be inherently unstable and thus far more responsive and agile than any other fighter of its generation. It also permitted the F-16 to be used as a testbed to investigate newer control-configured concepts, which could be applied to future generation fighter designs. While the YF-16 had bested the twin-engine YF-17 in the Air Force's competition for a lightweight fighter, the YF-17, impressive in its own right, would ultimately be developed into the Navy's very successful FA-18 Hornet. Dramatic breakthroughs in metallurgy and propulsion technology permitted the new F-15 Eagle to be configured with engines whose thrust, for the first time, exceeded the aircraft's weight. The first Air Force fighter designed specifically for the air superiority role since the legendary F-86, its unparalleled performance, combined with its vast array of sophisticated radar and fire control systems, provided it with an unparalleled combat capability. It had also been years since the Air Force had dedicated an aircraft solely to close air support. That gap was filled in the early 70s when the YA-9 flew head-to-head against the YA-10 in a competition ultimately won by the A-10. Literally built around a 30mm cannon, the Thunderbolt II was developed into a combat system capable of delivering awesome and destructive firepower. While test pilots at Edwards evaluated the capabilities of a new advanced tanker cargo aircraft, the wide-body KC-10 Extender, flight researchers were also investigating the future of air transport with the YC-14 and 15. A pair of short takeoff and landing technology demonstrators embodying the latest concepts in aerodynamics, propulsion, and flight controls, which would be applied directly to the next generation of cargo aircraft. For the first time in more than 2 decades, the combat potential of a new intercontinental strategic bomber was also evaluated. The B-1A was designed to contend with the revolution in air defense technologies which had taken place since the late 50s. Instead of speed and altitude, elusiveness was now the key to the penetration of enemy airspace. And the terrain-hugging B-1 was designed to evade enemy radar by flying fast and low. Many said, however, that the day of the manned bomber was past, and in the late 70s, it was canceled. But to paraphrase Mark Twain, all reports of the demise of the manned bomber and the B-1 were quite premature. For the interim, an old warhorse, the venerable B-52, was updated with new avionics, tested as a standoff launch platform for sophisticated air-launched cruise missiles capable of navigating on their own over hundreds of miles of terrain, hitting a target on the center's Utah Test and Training Range with pinpoint accuracy. It would never fly in space, or even exceed the speed of sound, but the shuttle Enterprise set the stage for sister ships that would. Launched from atop a 747 jumbo jet, it would make a critical series of unpowered approach and landing tests at Edwards during 1977 that paved the way for man's first gliding descents from outer space. And indeed, just 4 years later, in April of 1981, Edwards once again became the scene of high drama as the Space Shuttle Columbia's wheels touched down on Rogers Dry Lake after it had passed through a fiery re-entry at more than 17,000 miles per hour halfway around the globe. The shuttles marked the dawn of a new era in space exploration, the era of reusable space vehicles, true spaceships, and it seemed only fitting that Edwards, where so much aerospace history had been made, where so much of the work that had made the shuttle possible had been accomplished, that Edwards should be the site of its milestone flights. While shuttle operations proceeded, flight researchers at Edwards continued to advance knowledge in the aeronautical realm throughout the 1980s, as they studied the characteristics of unique aircraft, such as NASA's scissor-winged AD-1, which was tested to explore the possible performance advantages to be gained by pivoting an airplane's entire wing while in flight. Benefiting from remarkable advances in composite materials, the X-29 soared on blade-thin wings that actually swept forward so that Air Force and NASA researchers could explore the configuration's potential for enhanced agility, better low-speed handling qualities, and lower stall speeds. The Advanced Fighter Technology Integration, or AFD F-111, explored the performance advantages promised by a mission-adaptive wing. A flexible, absolutely smooth-surfaced, variable cambered wing, which could be configured to optimize maneuverability, performance, and fuel efficiency for each phase of the airplane's envelope. And the AFD F-16, which incorporated features permitting it to fly as no other aircraft had ever flown. A triplex digital flight control system and forward-mounted canards, for example, that permitted it to turn without banking. A voice-actuated command system, an automated maneuvering attack system, and a host of other new technologies applicable to the whole spectrum of tactical combat operations. The Air Force's short takeoff and landing and maneuvering technology demonstrator F-15 was yet another one-of-a-kind testbed. Configured with two-dimensional thrust vectoring and reversing engine nozzles, it demonstrated much enhanced agility and dramatically improved STOL capabilities. Over the years, veteran test pilot Fitz Fulton had skillfully guided many a stricken ship to safe landings at Edwards. But in December of 1984, he was sitting in a cockpit on the ground as he intentionally guided a perfectly healthy 720 jetliner to a crash landing. The test was conducted to evaluate a fuel additive, which promised to prevent the ignition of massive fireballs. It obviously didn't work, and predictably, reporters called the test failure. They were wrong. Not only did it demonstrate the ineffectiveness of the additive, it also provided a wealth of information that would enhance flight safety in the future. One of the most spectacular events of the 80s, however, occurred not on the lakebed, but high over the Pacific, where Major Doug Pearson prepared to find the proverbial needle in a haystack as he launched a missile toward a satellite orbiting high overhead.
Eagle 06 is in the recovery. Hey, here, you beautiful son of a bitch! God, is that beautiful? F-15's all over the sky, a missile going up. Nail that Hummer. I had to do one little roll anyway.
The anti-satellite missile scored a direct hit in a technological feat which might never again be duplicated. One-of-a-kind aircraft and events have become almost commonplace at Edwards over the years, but they represent only a small part of the center's workload. The primary job has always been to ensure that, if the need arises, American aircrews will go into combat with the most effective and reliable operational aircraft in the world. And it continued to meet this challenge as the capabilities of existing systems were refined and expanded, and as dynamic new capabilities, such as the Lantern system, were added. The painstaking development of this system at Edwards paid off dramatically, as Lantern proved it could deny adversaries the once comforting sanctuary of night. Because they're expected to have extended service lives, modern combat planes are designed with an enormous amount of growth potential, which will enable them to meet new requirements and keep up with the rapid pace of technological change. The modified F-16XL, for example, was proposed to meet a new requirement for a fighter combining air-to-air and interdiction capabilities. Its potential was compared with that of the twin-engine F-15 in an evaluation which ultimately resulted in the development of the new F-15E dual-role fighter, a craft which would go on to prove its remarkable combat effectiveness in the Persian Gulf. All airplanes, and especially highly sophisticated combat airplanes, suffer growing pains as they pass through the lengthy ordeal of development. The B-1B, revived in the early 80s, certainly had more than its share of critics throughout the decade, but it truly represented an amalgam of incredibly complex, state-of-the-art systems, and despite its critics, it was developed into the most potent penetrating bomber in the world. More impressive still, promising the ability to penetrate any airspace without the need for complex defensive avionics. The B-2 Advanced Technology Bomber was the first giant flying wing to soar over the base 4 decades. Its thin silhouette, compound curves, its stealth technology, promised the ultimate cloak of invisibility, even against the most sophisticated air defense radar systems. Like the turbojet engine 4 decades earlier, stealth technology promised to revolutionize the design and capabilities of combat aircraft. And as the Flight Test Center entered the 90s and began to face the tremendous technological challenges of the 21st century, it was engaged in the evaluation of a pair of competing designs which embodied the latest in that technology. The radically different appearance of the YF-22 and the YF-23 was really but a pale reflection of the quantum leap in capabilities which each represented. Built for stealth, they were also beneficiaries of the many technologies, innovative concepts, which had recently proven their worth in tests at Edwards. Indeed, they took them a step or more further and blended them into fighter prototypes whose stretched the imagination. To fighter jocks from any previous era, for example, the possibility that they could cruise at supersonic speeds without use of an afterburner was little more than a fantasy dream. In these aircraft, the dream became reality. Incredibly worthy opponents, only one could win. And in April 1991, the YF-22 was selected to project American air power into the 21st century as the Advanced Tactical Fighter. Flight testing such craft has become a remarkably complex operation. Where once, not so long ago, knee pads and pilot recall provided practically the only instrumentation, systems-intensive fighters are now instrumented for as many as 4,000 different parameters, and the data is telemetered instantly to the ground for analysis even before the pilot touches down. We're in an age of spiraling technology, especially in the burgeoning field of electronic systems, and this has created an information explosion which makes each flight test hour incredibly valuable and costly. To reduce those costs, the Flight Test Center has built up an impressive ground test capability in recent years, the largest anechoic chamber in the nation, a neighboring facility for integrated avionics testing, and a test and evaluation mission simulator. They comprise the core of a capability to thoroughly test a full range of onboard electronic systems on the ground before they're subjected to the real world of flight test, where indeed they'll always still have to ultimately prove their worth. Edwards has been called a place where dreams take flight. And truly, for more than 40 years, the Air Force, indeed the whole world of aerospace, has continued to meet its future in the skies above its sprawling expanse. The history of the base is a kaleidoscope of images representing man's greatest achievements in flight. There's a special feeling that one gets there, an awareness of continuity. The lakebed remains a welcome haven for pilots in distress. An uncommon sense of achievement and tradition, unforgettable links to the legendary past, and an overpowering feeling of expectation, of a limitless future, and almost an article of faith, the belief that if it can happen, it will probably happen here. The story of Edwards, then, is a fabric woven of change and continuity, and so well symbolized in the Flight Test Center's logo. For the legend at its base, ad inexplorata, Latin for toward the unexplored, is really more than just a motto. It represents a bridge between its past, its present, and its future.
The X-15, designed to be purely and simply a research vehicle to provide aerodynamic, flight dynamic, and structural response data for use in the development of future manned hypersonic vehicles such as the Space Shuttle. No hypersonic wind tunnels, past or present, can provide accurate data for the design of a full-scale hypersonic airplane. The frontiers of flight today are the same as they were in the 1950s, the exploration of hypersonic flight. The X-15 will ultimately be viewed as the Wright Flyer of hypersonic airplanes. The X-15 flew to speeds and altitudes never previously achieved by winged vehicles. On the crisp, clear morning of November 9, 1961, a prospector working any of the many small mining claims in the bleak country around Mott Lake would have noticed the telltale broad white contrail signaling the approach of a strange formation of aircraft. If his eyesight was particularly acute, he might have discerned a giant Boeing NB-52B Stratofortress arrowing through Nevada's dark blue sky, flanked by two sleek little fighters, a North American F-100 Super Sabre and a Lockheed F-104 Starfighter. As he watched, he might have seen a long black dart drop from the B-52, followed by the sudden boom and crackling rumble of an igniting rocket engine. Boosted by 60,000 pounds of thrust, it let the head of the big bomber and its chase planes, accelerating upwards as it burned a ton of anhydrous ammonia and liquid oxygen every 12 seconds. It arced into the trans-atmosphere, its white exhaust trail pointing like a finger toward the future. Not quite 90 seconds later, it was level at 102,000 feet, streaking towards Edwards Air Force Base in Southern California at Mach 6.04. Air Force test pilot Major Robert White had just become the first man to take an airplane to Mach 6, 6 times the speed of sound, flying the second of 3 North American Aviation X-15 research airplanes. Slightly less than 8 minutes and 200 miles later, trailed by another F-104 chase plane, the X-15, its propellants exhausted and now the world's fastest glider, dropped into a steep curve to a landing flare and touchdown on runway 18, marked out on the hard-baked clay of Rogers Dry Lake, the world's largest natural landing site. The X-15 program was a natural outgrowth of progression of aviation since the time of the Wrights. The biplane had given way to the streamlined monoplane, and by the late 1930s, the first experimental jet engines had appeared, promising an era of high-speed flight. But as an airplane flew closer to the speed of sound, it encountered compressibility, the bunching up of air around it as it neared Mach 1, causing high drag, buffeting, changes in structural loads, and even loss of control and in-flight breakups. For more than a decade, until Chuck Yeager flew the first Bell XS-1, later X-1, to Mach 1.06 in October of 1947, it seemed that the speed of sound might indeed be a barrier to the future flight. Afterward, aviation accelerated rapidly into the supersonic era. Mach 2 fell to Scott Crossfield, and the second Douglas D-558-2 skyrocket in November 1953, and Mach 3 to Captain Milburn Apt and the first Bell X-2 in September 1956, though tragically, he perished when the plane went out of control during its return to Edwards. By the time of Apt's death, the X-15 program was well underway. Its designers faced formidable challenges. Bell had built advanced variants of the X-1 that could excel at Mach 2 and 90,000 feet, and the swept-wing X-2 could climb above 125,000 feet. Both hinted at control challenges the X-15 would face. In 1956, when test pilot Captain Ivan C. Kinch coasted to above 126,000 feet, his X-2 was like an artillery shell following a ballistic parabola. Near the top of its climb, as the plane decelerated after its rocket engine ran out of propellant, its ailerons, elevators, and rudder were useless due to the very low dynamic pressure encountered as it passed through the upper atmosphere. The X-2 began a slow left roll, arced over the top of its ballistic parabola, and, As its speed and, consequently, dynamic pressure increased in the lower atmosphere, its flight controls regained their effectiveness, and Kinchlow was able to guide it back to a safe landing on Edwards Broad lakebed. Clearly, flying above 100,000 feet, future rocket planes would require reaction controls, small jet thrusters such as those employed on the first manned spacecraft, in addition to conventional aerodynamic control surfaces. Aerodynamic heating in the high-altitude environment pose their own problems. Unlike supersonic flight, which is differentiated by the speed of sound and the distinctive crack of a sonic boom, hypersonic flight is characterized primarily by increasing aerodynamic heating with intensity hot airflows and sharply angled shock waves washing over the structure, their interactions producing even greater heat. The structure could not be conventional, for the plane would be subject to skin temperatures above 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, necessitating extensive thermal protection. Inside the fully pressurized cockpit, the pilot would be more astronaut than airman, wearing a pressure suit and helmet capable of functioning in space-like conditions should cabin pressure be lost. Interest in hypersonic flight predated the supersonic revolution. The three great prophets of the space age, Russia's Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, the Romanian-German Hermann Oberth, and America's Robert Goddard, all advocated hypersonic airplanes as a means of flying into space, and German rocket enthusiast Max Valier, before his death and the explosion of an experimental rocket engine, recommended developing rocket-powered either planes as intercontinental airliners. In the 1930s, Austrian engineer Eugen Sanger and the mathematician Irene Brett undertook the world's first science-based hypersonic design, their so-called Silbervogel, Silver Bird. Proposed as a space transport and later as a global strike aircraft, it became an extraordinarily influential design study. Right after World War II, Joseph Stalin, according to a Soviet military defector, even sent a team into Western Europe on a fruitless mission to kidnap authors, hoping that Soviet Sanga planes would make it easier for us to talk to the gentleman shopkeeper Harry Truman. The combination of the Sanga-Brett study and example of the Nazi A4 V2 ballistic missile greatly simulated post-war American, Soviet, and European interest in rockets, missiles, and hypersonic aircraft. While the Sanga-Brett study had been purely theoretical, the A4 program had extensively studied Mach 4 plus wing derivatives, one of which, the A4B, flew before war's end, though it broke up during its terminal glide to Earth. The Soviet-American race to develop atomic-armed ballistic missiles fostered heating and re-entry studies, evolution of the blunt body re-entry shape, and high-temperature materials research. It also encouraged studies of rocket-boosted winged global-ranging hypersonic vehicles, even orbital spacecraft. In America, from all this sprang the X-15 and X-20 programs, though the latter never flew. The roots of the X-15 reflected a broad base of military, industrial, and governmental research support. In 1951, Robert Woods, Bell Aircraft Corporation's chief engineer and a member of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, prestigious aeronautics committee, called for development of new research airplane with performance similar to the A4s. His continued pressure led NACA's executive committee to endorse, a year later, investigating flight conditions between Mach 4 and Mach 10. The agency formed a hypersonic study committee under Langley Aeronautical Laboratory, now NASA Langley Research Center, engineer Clinton Brown, which subsequently advocated greatly expanded ground and flight research tests using models and specialized test techniques. The committee even suggested modifying the X-2 with a strap-on booster to increase performance above Mach 4, adding reaction controls for flight safety. Program delays and eventual loss of both airplane doomed that idea. In 1953, the Air Force's Scientific Advisory Board concluded the time is ripe for a Mach 5 to 7 hypersonic vehicle, and the U.S. Navy's Office of Naval Research issued a study contract to Douglas for a Mach 7 plus design, tentatively designated the D558-3. Air Force and Navy interest proved crucial to getting the X-15 program off the drawing board and into the air. The next year, 1954, marked the genesis of the X-15. Another NACA study team, headed by John Becker, undertook preliminary design of a Mach 6 rocket-boosted hypersonic research airplane. It had a nickel alloy and Connell structure, rocket-like four-fin tail, and off-shelf rockets from the Hermes program. Becker's study anticipated many of the X-15's features and encouraged NACA that summer to invite the military services to join with it in developing such an aircraft. In October, they formed the NACA Air Force Navy Research Aircraft Committee, subsequently known as the X-15 Committee. A joint program directive issued on December 23rd gave technical oversight to NACA and design and construction authority to the Air Force. The Navy and Air Force would jointly fund the effort. The Air Force supervised the design competition in 1955 between Bell, Douglas, North American, and Republic. Bell's Robert Woods, who had launched the company's earlier X-1 effort, might reasonably have expected his firm to win, since it had already built and flown the X-1, X-2, and X-5. Douglas's Ed Heinemann, with his D-55-8 Skystreak and Skyrocket, plus the D-55-3 study, might have as well. Both companies produced relatively cheap designs, each promising to deliver 3 airplanes for a total cost of $36 million. Harrison's Stormy Storms, a veteran of North American's many fighter programs, led the design team that drafted his firm's entry at an estimated $56 million, the most expensive proposal. But both Bell and Douglas's designs were considered too technically risky, and Republic's, which was technically insufficient and also more costly than the Bell and Douglas proposals, came in last. Accordingly, despite the huge cost disparity, the Air Force notified North American on September 30th that it had won the competition. On June 11, 1956, after final negotiations, North American received a $42.9 million contract, about $349 million today, for the 3 X-15s. 3 months later, Reaction Motors Incorporated was awarded with a $10.7 million contract for their engines. The X-15 program involved far more than simply designing a new airplane, however novel it might be. Its rocket engine, pilot protection system, environmental controls and flight control system, as well as its flight test range, posed complex challenges. The X-15's XLR-99 engine, more than 3 times as powerful as the X-2s and 8 times as powerful as the X-1s, proved particularly risky. Developed by New Jersey-based Reaction Motors, the XLR-99 was based on the earlier XLR-30, used in the Navy's Viking high-altitude rocket program. Any hopes that the Viking experience would help with its design proved illusory. Unlike the XLR-30, which burned diluted alcohol and liquid oxygen, the 57,000-pound thrust XLR-99 burned 1,445 gallons of more explosive anhydrous ammonia and 1,000 gallons of IOX. More significant, however, Takeoff had to man-rate the engine, i.e., make it safe enough for operation in a piloted airplane, capable of repeated use, and both throttleable and restartable in flight. This was not easy to achieve, particularly as its high-speed turbopump, a potential source of disaster, fed the engine propellants at a rate of 167 pounds per second. Eventually, the XLR-99 became a reliable power plant with a rated operational life of about 1 hour, about 40 flights before requiring overhaul. Such reliability came at a price for a far longer than anticipated development period, compelling North American to complete the first 2 X-15s with older XLR-11 engines for their proving flights. The X-15 required a complex flight control system, a conventional fighter-like stick controlled an all-moving tail that furnished pitch and roll control, but was used only during approach and landing. During high-G acceleration, climb, and re-entry, the pilot relied on a side-stick controller, a reaction control system operating small hydrogen peroxide jet thrusters located in the nose and wings, furnished pitch, roll, and yaw inputs at high altitudes, where conventional controls were ineffective. Eventually, the third X-15s flew with an adaptive flight control system that automatically compensated for changing dynamic pressure, blending the reactor control system with the conventional aerodynamic controls. Since the X-15 was technically a boost glider, Once it exhausted its propellants, the pilot had to carefully manage his energy to ensure he could reach Rogers Dry Lake. To help him in doing this, the X-15 would always be flown so that it had excess energy at burnout, which the pilot could use as bleed-off using large pedal-like speed brakes installed in the side of a massive dorsal and ventral fins. Unlike earlier rocket-powered aircraft that flew near Edwards AFB, the X-15 demanded a special flight test corridor, dubbed the High Range, running roughly 480 miles from Wendover, Utah, southwest to Edwards. Crossing multiple mountain ranges in the stark southwestern desert, the High Range was itself a notable technical accomplishment, foreshadowing the manned spacecraft tracking network NASA established for Project Mercury several years later. NASA furnished 2 tracking stations at Ely and Beatty, Nevada, as well as at Edwards. Furthermore, unlike research airplanes, the X-15 required a complex flight simulator to train pilots and undertake mission planning and rehearsal. The simulator was updated using data required during X-15 flights, with pilots typically spending 40 to 50 hours in it before undertaking the 10 to 12-minute flight. When the program commenced, it was hoped the X-15 might be flying by the end of 1957. Due to the complexity of its design and technical challenges involved, however, test flights did not begin until 1959. In the interim, NASA and the Air Force supported the X-15 development effort with extensive wind tunnel and free flight ballistic tunnel testing, evaluated reaction controls on ground simulator rigs and unmodified research airplanes including the Bell X-1B and F-104, and undertook extensive simulation studies to prepare for the crucial challenges faced by a hypersonic rocket plane having, for its first time, the lowest lift-to-drag ratio ever flown on a piloted aircraft. In October 1957, Sputnik had seized the public imagination, and the national debate over American science and technology that followed, NACA had given way to the space-focused NASA. Now the X-15 took on greater urgency and visibility as a symbol of America's progression into space. Vice President Richard Nixon presided over its rollout at North American's Los Angeles facility on October 15, 1958, a year after the Soviet satellite ushered in the new space age. It was a remarkable-looking aircraft, burnished metallic black, with thin wings and horizontal tail surfaces, and, because of the directional stability requirements of high supersonic and hypersonic flight, large meat cleaver dorsal and ventral vertical fins, the lower half of the ventral surface jettisonable during landing approach so that the X-15's landing skids could be a reasonable size. Although planners had originally thought the X-15 would use a modified Convair B-36 as a mothership, the retirement of the B-36 and the availability of the more powerful and capable B-52A led to its substitution for Convair's giant intercontinental bomber. Early tests with the X-15 proved far from encouraging. Piloted by North American test pilot Scott Crossfield, who had been so dedicated to the project that, as it began, he left NACA for North American, the first X-15 AF-56-6670 made its maiden captive flight on March 10, 1959, followed by its first glide flight on June 8. During the landing approach, Crossfield encountered serious longitudinal control problems that pushed his piloting skills to the limit, necessitating adjustments to the boosted flight control system. The second X-15, AF-56-6671, made the type's first powered flight on September 17. Propelled by 2 XLR-11 engines, it reached Mach 2.11 at 52,341 feet. He completed another powered flight into Mach 2.15 a month later, but then, on November 5th, disaster struck when an engine fire forced an emergency landing on Rosamond Dry Lake, during which 6,671 broke its back. While the second X-15 returned to North American for repairs and installation of its XLR-99, proving flights continued through 1960, with 6670 still equipped with its interim XLR-11s. The third X-15, AF-56-6672, was the first completed with the big tactical XLR-99. But during an Edwards ground test, the engine blew up, catapulting the rest of the airplane forward. Safe in its cockpit, Crossfield marveled at the X-15's strength and worried for the safety of crews trying to extricate him. The plane, like the second X-15, returned to North American for a rebuild. Not until November 15, 1960, 3 years late, would the X-15 fly with its XLR-99 engine, when Crossfield took 6671 to Mach 2.97, marking the end of its contractor flight test program. But now, the X-15 hits its stride. On March 7, 1961, Air Force Major Robert M. White became the first pilot to exceed Mach 4. He piloted the second X-15 across the hypersonic divide on June 23, attaining Mach 5.72. White completed a sonic trifecta by exceeding Mach 6 on November 9, as previously mentioned. Nor was the boyish airman the X-15's only record setter. On August 22, 1963, NASA research pilot Joseph Walker attained 354,200 feet in the third X-15, taking it into space. Marring this was a serious landing accident on November 9, 1962, that virtually destroyed the second X-15 and seriously injured NASA pilots Jack McKay. When an engine failure necessitated a heavyweight emergency landing on Mott Lake, 6671's skid landing gear collapsed. Even this setback was turned to advantage, for NASA lengthened the X-15 and added provisions for 2 huge drop takes and a dummy supersonic combustion ramjet engine installation on the shortened lower vertical fin. Eventually, on October 3, 1967, Major William J. Pete Knight reached Mach 6.7 flying this aircraft, designated the X-15A2. During the flight, unanticipated heating led to multiple structural failures, causing the scramjet module to separate from the aircraft and damaging the fuel jettison system. Knight, a superlative airman, landed safely. Sadly, shortly after Knight's remarkable flight, the fastest by a piloted airplane, the 20th century, Air Force test pilot Major Michael Adams, was killed in the third X-15. On November 15, 1967, during a high-altitude flight, it entered a Mach 5 plus spin, and it broke well above Mach 4 during an inverted dive into the lower atmosphere. The accident stemmed from a fatal combustion of instrumentation and control systems failures, plus human factors. Less than a year later, on October 24, 1968, the X-15 completed its last flight, its 199th, flown by NASA pilot William Dana. NASA attempted a 200th flight on December 20th, but Edward was untypically swathed in snow. Planners took it as an omen and simply retired the craft. The first X-15 went to the National Air and Space Museum, where it may be seen in the Milestones of Flight Gallery, and the second, the fastest airplane of the 20th century, to the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force. Altogether, 12 distinguished pilots, Scott Crossfield, Robert White, Forrest Peterston, Neil Armstrong, Joe Walker, Jack McKay, Milt Thompson, Robert Rushworth, Mike Adams, Bill Dana, Pete Knight, and Joe Engel had flown the X-15 to speeds and altitudes never previously achieved by winged vehicles. Its research program consisted of an aerodynamic and structural heating investigation phase from 1959 through 1963, and a follow-on program utilizing the X-15 to carry experiments into the upper atmosphere or to hypersonic speeds. Much of the applications program benefited from the contemporaneous Apollo effort, but it also helped sensor and missile detection efforts. X-15 flights produced more than 700 technical reports, establishing a database still considered essential today, as hypersonics advances into the second century of flight. The X-15 was by no means a perfect research vehicle. Under some circumstances, it had dangerous flight characteristics, and heavy impact loads sorely tested its landing skids. During re-entry, in-flight reconnaissance effects could interact with its flight control system. Early on, researchers discovered gaps in panels that permitted the entry of hot hypersonic air into its structure, necessitating fixes. Cockpit outer window panels shattered from heat-distorted panel frame structural loads, forcing redesign, and its nose landing gear twice extended in flight due to thermal stress. There were several landing incidents and accidents, one major ground explosion, and, of course, the sad loss of the third X-15 with Mike Adams. But overall, as a product of the pre-computer design era and without the benefit of modern tools such as computational fluid dynamics and computer-aided design and manufacturing, the X-15 constituted a remarkable achievement and an astonishing productive research program bridging the age of flight and the age of space. Fittingly, two of its most distinguished pilots went on to greater fame in the U.S. space program. Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon, and Joe Engle became one of NASA's first Space Shuttle mission commanders. Today, Air Force and NASA researchers pursue Mach 6 hypersonic flight with the air-breathing Boeing Pratt & Whitney Rocketdyne X-51A Wave Rider scramjet research vehicle. Tellingly, its designation, X-51, was deliberately chosen and reserved to echo the X-15 and remind researchers of the remarkable aircraft that, a half a century ago, did so much to make hypersonic flight a reality.
He decided he wanted to design aircraft when he was 12 years old after reading Tom Swift and his airplane. He designed his first plane before he'd ever seen one in person. When he first applied for a job at Lockheed, the company turned him down flat. He got his master's degree in aeronautical engineering and returned and was rewarded for his persistence with an $83 a month job as a tool designer. By the time his career at Lockheed ended 47 years later, he had built the most important aircraft research and design facility in the world. There, in Lockheed's legendary Skunk Works, he and the team he led revolutionized aviation. For 30 years, it was impossible to see a significant display of American aircraft without seeing something Kelly Johnson had designed. Whether it was a fighter, bomber, transport, passenger liner, or even a spy plane, the odds were that he had designed at least part of it. Without question, he is the greatest aircraft designer in history. He is Clarence Kelly Johnson. Clarence Kelly Johnson was born in the town of Ishpeming in Michigan's Upper Peninsula on February 27, 1910. The son of Swedish immigrants, he got his Irish nickname from schoolmates after he stood up to the school bully.
He had been dealing with some of the kids at the school calling him Clara, since his first name was Clarence. And he finally had his fill of it and decided to take reprisals on one of the bullies. And after he was finished, the kids in the schoolyard decided that he could no longer be a Clara, and instead they were going to find some more appropriate name. And since Irishmen were known at that time for their pugilistic skill, they decided to dub him Kelly.
He designed his first airplane, which he called the Merlin Battle Plane, as a 12-year-old, and it won him a prize at school. He knew then that was what he wanted to do with his life. He paid $5 for his first flight, a 3-minute trip in a biplane that ended badly when the plane's engine conked out at 700 feet. When he got older, he worked in construction and in the Buick factory and saved his money. He took his savings to a flight school and asked to be taught to fly. The flight instructor, a cash-strapped barnstormer, refused Johnson's money and told the young man to spend it on college. Johnson enrolled at the University of Michigan just before the stock market crash in 1929 and supported himself washing dishes in fraternity houses. As an assistant in the aeronautical engineering department, he worked with the school's wind tunnel. The school allowed him to rent the tunnel out when it wasn't in use. Johnson charged $35 an hour and helped design a new, streamlined Studebaker model. He graduated in 1932 and tried to enlist in the Army Air Corps, but was refused. He returned to Michigan for his master's degree and, among other things, used the Michigan Wind Tunnel to help design aerodynamic racing cars for the Indianapolis 500. In 1933, he went to work for Lockheed in California as an $83 a month tool designer. Lockheed at the time was a deeply troubled company. It had just emerged from bankruptcy and had bet its future on the Electra, a two-engine transport. When Johnson arrived in Burbank, his boss asked him what he thought of the plane. Johnson looked and said it would be unstable and that he did not trust Lockheed's wind tunnel tests. Chief Engineer Hall Hibbard sent Johnson back to Michigan with a model of the Electra and a mandate to do his own study in his own wind tunnel. "See if you can do better," Hibbard told him. He did. After 72 tunnel tests, Johnson came up with a newly designed flap system and traded the Electra's single stabilizer for a twin tail. Those changes stabilized the Electra and helped make it one of the most successful airplanes of its time. Johnson returned to Lockheed a full engineer. Assigned as the Model 10 Electra's flight test engineer, he at last started flying on a regular basis. He befriended Amelia Earhart and advised her on several of her missions. She flew an Electra, and Johnson advised her on techniques of fuel mixing to help her get the best performance out of her plane. He continued to work on updates to the Electra through Electra Model 14, and was soon attracting attention outside of Lockheed. In 1937, he won the Sperry Award for outstanding achievements in aeronautics by a young man. That same year, Congress passed the Neutrality Act. That law was designed to keep the United States out of World War II. At the same time, those in the military had become convinced that American involvement in the war was inevitable. They threw as many of their precious dollars as they could into the design of new equipment. Lockheed won the competition to build a new fighter with a plane designed by Johnson, the XP-38. With two engines and a double fuselage, it was an unconventional aircraft that had its share of problems. In particular, its high speed and tight maneuvering sometimes created forces so great that they shattered the plane in midair. Once again, Johnson went back to his wind tunnel, and after making a few changes to the plane's design, it passed Army Air Corps muster and was ordered into limited production. Johnson, the designer, was 27 years old. In the late 1930s, Lockheed came back from bankruptcy largely on the strength of its commercial aircraft. The Electra in particular had built a profitable customer base. But if Lockheed was going to grow, it was going to have to build a successful military aircraft business. The P-38 was a start, though when the Army Air Force first awarded the contract, no one knew how many thousands of planes would eventually be built. In 1938, with Europe on the brink of war, the British sent a purchasing commission to the United States in search of military aircraft, particularly a long-distance coastal patrol bomber that could be used to hunt submarines. The commission, scheduled to visit several aircraft manufacturers, did not originally intend to visit Lockheed. Their schedule changed at the last minute, and Lockheed was invited to make a presentation, with only 5 days to prepare. During the 5 days of preparation for the Brits, Johnson showed what he was destined to become famous for: the ability to make something entirely new out of existing components, and to manage a project to completion with a ruthless eye to the deadline.
He himself lived by the credo, be quick, be quiet, be on time. He was somebody who believed very much in getting good people and giving them the ability to do what they do best. He also believed in minimizing the number of people working on any one project.
In only 5 days, Johnson and his crew not only redesigned the Electra to fit the needs of the Royal Air Force, they also built from scratch a full-scale wooden model of the plane, a civilian transport converted into a medium bomber. The Brits were amazed. They were so impressed by Johnson and his crew, they invited Lockheed executives to England to confer with the Air Ministry. Johnson went along. At the meetings, the British changed the design specifications, necessitating a complete redesign of the aircraft. Johnson locked himself in a London hotel room and in only 72 hours completed the engineering drawings. The British were, once again, amazed, and Lockheed got the contract. But not before the British expressed their hesitancy about working with an engineer as young and inexperienced as the 28-year-old Johnson. Lockheed reassured the Air Minister, who ordered 200 of what became known as the Hudson Bomber. It was the largest single order of aircraft ever received by an American manufacturer. And upon the party's return to the United States, Lockheed promoted Johnson to chief engineer. In 1939, the Congress significantly increased the defense budget, and P-38 started rolling off the line in record numbers. During this period, Johnson truly mastered the art of manufacturing, streamlining production processes, and developing an entirely new job, the program manager. Now a staple of manufacturing, the program manager is a person far down the chain of command who has working control of a project. If that all seems a bit heavy on the business administration in a discussion of aircraft, consider this. Johnson believed that outstanding aircraft designed and manufactured quickly were inevitably the product of a single visionary. That visionary was usually, of course, Johnson.
He was not someone who believed in development via committee. He was also somebody who hated lengthy reports and normally limited any report that was sent to him to 20 pages. He believed in brevity, he believed in clarity, and he believed in giving people the tools necessary to get the job done.
In 1943, Lockheed put Johnson in charge of advanced products research, setting him up on a plot of land on the outskirts of Burbank, California. Johnson called his new kingdom the Skunk Works, after the still in a cartoon strip, Little Abner, that was responsible for the making of a mysterious and powerful brew called Skunk Works.
In the Little Abner cartoon, there was a potent mystery elixir known as Kickapoo Joy Juice. And Kickapoo Joy Juice was made at the Skunk Works, or Skunk Works, as it was called in the comic strip, through a variety of things that were thrown into a giant mixture, among them skunks, old shoes, and things like that. And the nickname was applied to the Lockheed operation because, indeed, it was a mystery elixir. Nobody was quite sure what was going on in there, but they knew that a lot of things were being thrown into it and that Kelly Johnson was pulling a lot of people from various locations in order to create something interesting.
The job of the Skunk Works was to quickly, cheaply, and secretly develop advanced aircraft that could help win the war. Its first assignment was the P-80 Shooting Star, the first American jet. Intelligence had determined the Germans were far along in their development of jets, and the not-so-secret fear of the Army Air Force was that the Nazis would deploy their jets in large numbers before the war in Europe had ended. The effect on the Allied bombing campaign would have been horrendous. The Allies' propeller-driven fighters would have been almost useless against a jet-powered fighter.
Kelly Johnson, in his efforts to oversee those operations, would pull people from other projects and would go about trying to get a minimum number of the very best people and put them on the project, give them minimal supervision, but let them trust them to be able to do the jobs that they're chosen to do.
After setting up the Skunk Works and recruiting his team, Johnson went to work on the P-80. Lockheed's contract with the Army Air Force gave him an incredibly short schedule, 180 days. Johnson went on a binge of designing and set his team to work on various critical paths and had the prototype ready for testing 37 days ahead of schedule. In 5 months, Lockheed had designed and built the first American jet. They hauled it from Burbank to Muroc Air Base in the California desert for testing. Fearful that there might be spies in the surrounding hills, they disguised the jet during transport with a plywood propeller. Johnson said years later that when he rolled out a new plane for testing, there was only one thing he thought about. What have I forgotten? In the case of the P-80, despite the short design and construction cycle, he hadn't forgotten much. It was a beautiful aircraft, faster and more agile than anything in the American arsenal. The war ended before it saw combat, but it evolved into the T-33, one of the best and longest-lived jet trainers in history. When the war ended, however, there were those who questioned whether the Skunk Works had a role to fill. After World War I, the business of aviation had shrunk almost to non-existent. After World War II, many people expected that it would again. But there were two basic differences between the ends of the wars. First, the United States was engaged in the world after World War II in a way it wasn't after World War I. No one could reasonably expect the world's only nuclear power to go back into hibernation. And second, before the war ended, it became clear that the post-war world would require a strong and ready military. Because on the day the Japanese surrendered, the world separated into two groups of allies, those in the communist East under the control of Joseph Stalin, and those in the democratic West. World War II was over, but the Cold War was just beginning. Kelly Johnson and the Skunk Works were just about to become the most important aircraft developers in the world. Over the course of his career, Kelly Johnson designed more than 40 aircraft. His most prolific period by far was in the 1950s. That was a decade of tremendous technological advance, achieved in an atmosphere of never-ending crisis. And there was no better place for aeronautical engineers to work than the Skunk Works. Johnson designed and built the Constellation, the most elegant aircraft of its time, and a plane that served effectively in both civilian and military roles. He experimented unsuccessfully with vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, with the idea that they could operate from relatively small ships. He designed the F-104 Starfighter, at 1,300 miles an hour, the fastest aircraft ever flown at the time. It was a sometimes fussy plane to fly, and at more than Mach 2, there wasn't a lot of room for error. It was adapted around the world to a number of difficult tasks, including carrying nuclear weapons. Johnson didn't approve of all the modifications others were making to his plane, but could do little about them. As the Cold War heated up, it became clear that the United States needed a way to peer deep into Russian territory. East of the Ural Mountains, where the Russians did their atomic research and where they developed their aircraft and missiles, the United States didn't even have an accurate topographical map, let alone a way of getting information on military capabilities. The Air Force put out a quiet request for a fast, high-altitude plane that could overfly Russia and bring back pictures of the communist secret bases. Johnson at first toyed with modifying the F-104, but it lacked the range and would be too difficult to fly on long missions. In 1954, he sent the Air Force a proposal to build a plane that could fly at a range of 4,000 miles above 70,000 feet. It would be slower than the Air Force had hoped, but at that altitude would be high above Russian air defenses. The Air Force didn't believe Johnson could do it. They doubted any jet engine would work at that altitude, and instead ordered a competition between manufacturers for the best biplane design. President Eisenhower approved a $35 million contract for the competition winner. Johnson and his Skunk Works team went into overdrive. In mid-November 1954, he met with a government advisory board on what was then called the CL-282 project. 10 days later, he formed the team to design the craft. On December 2nd, the first 12 engineers went to work designing the aircraft systems, and the first design drawings were completed and released to the shop for manufacture the next day. A week later, the drawings were complete, and by the end of the year, he'd won the contract and frozen the design. Wind tunnel testing completed in March, the first plane finished in July, and the first flight took place on August 4th, 1955. In less than a year, from pipe dream to first flight, Kelly Johnson and the Skunk Works had designed and built a completely new kind of airplane. The U-2 had something of a patched-together quality, to be sure. The first ones cut weight by leaving out the ejection seat, and the balancing wheels on the wings dropped off at takeoff to lose a few more pounds. The engineers were still making modifications on the craft in the summer of 1956, when a young pilot named Francis Gary Powers saw his first U-2 parked on a taxiway at a secret base in Nevada. It had not been built to last, he said years later. Powers was among the pilots who flew spy missions over the Russian heartland in the U-2, and for years it was safely out of range of the Soviets. The planes routinely returned with photographs showing Russian fighters 4 miles below them, coming up for a fight but unable to fly high enough to get a shot off. Eventually, however, the Russians improved their air defenses, and by the time Powers was shot down in 1960, Johnson was already at work on his next-generation spy plane. Johnson, with the U-2s flying with seeming impunity, had gone back to the government to propose a plane that could fly 10,000 feet higher and 4 times as fast as the subsonic U-2. Building a plane that would cruise at Mach 3.2, Johnson said years later, was the hardest thing the Skunk Works ever did. Everything about the plane, Johnson said, had to be invented. In 1960, the Air Force gave the go-ahead for Johnson to develop the A-12, a plane that didn't succeed as an interceptor, but paved the way for its slightly larger sister, the SR-71 Blackbird. Built out of titanium, which is light and could tolerate the 500-degree temperatures that built up as the plane sliced through the atmosphere at more than 3 times the speed of sound, the Blackbirds were like something out of a science fiction movie. The rollout was Johnson's proudest day. It was, he said, the smoothest test flight he'd ever been through. Johnson, who had never been much of a talker, insisted that he was not bothered by the fact that he couldn't talk about his perfect airplane. If I can talk about it, he'd like to say, it's obsolete. But years later, when word of the SR-71 had leaked out and the Air Force had stopped denying its existence, he took joy in its racing from New York to London, a distance of almost 3,500 miles in less than 2 hours. And before the Blackbirds were retired in March 1990, an SR-71 flew across the United States coast to coast in 68 minutes. Kelly Johnson retired from Lockheed in 1975. Even then, he was a presence at the Skunk Works. His 14 rules of effective program management are gospel there and are taught in some of the leading business schools in the world. Johnson even consulted with Lockheed during the development of the F-117 stealth fighter. As an old man, he said that there would come a time when aircraft were no longer relevant. People wouldn't travel for business, he said, because they could sit at their desks and talk to people in Europe by video phone. And on the battlefield, manned aircraft were no longer cost-effective in an age of missiles. Though it hasn't happened yet, don't bet against it.
I think his greatest contribution was in the vision that he had for the Skunk Works, for Lockheed, for American aviation, and in his ability to translate that vision into something that other people embraced and believed in and wanted to work toward. To a great extent, his greatest contribution was his ability to get other people to commit to his dream.
Kelly Johnson died just before Christmas in 1990.
We knew that, overflying Russia for 4 years, that they were making important advances in radar and missiles. And so in 1958, 2 years before Gary Powers was shot down, we decided we'd try to make a follow-on airplane, which became finally the SR-71, to fly higher and 4 times as fast. So that's the connection between the grandfather type and the SR-71.
Everyone called him Kelly. And as he reminisced that day about the genesis of his Mach 3 masterpiece, he could have just as easily reflected back on a time when aircraft designers were striving for 200 miles per hour, a time when he landed his first job with the fledgling Lockheed Aircraft Company. In 1932, a small group led by Robert E. Gross had purchased Lockheed out of bankruptcy for $40,000 and staked the company's future on the development of an all-metal, twin-engine transport. Models of the design were sent to the University of Michigan, where a young graduate student named Clarence L. Johnson conducted wind tunnel tests. Although his faculty advisors gave the design a passing grade, he wasn't much impressed, and after he had been hired on as a tool designer at Lockheed in August of 1933, he let Chief Design Engineer Hal Hibbard know about it. Among other things, it'd be directionally unstable, especially with one engine out. A rather presumptuous and certainly unconventional way for a 23-year-old to start his career at the new company, but it was only a hint of what would follow. The son of Swedish immigrants, he'd been nicknamed Kelly by classmates because of his quick temper, stubborn tenacity, and unwillingness to back down from a fight, even against overwhelming odds. Instead of reminding the outspoken young man of his place, Hibbard suggested he go back to the wind tunnel and see if he could improve the design. After 72 test runs, he came up with the solution, an unconventional twin-tail arrangement soon to become a Lockheed trademark. And the Model 10 Electra became the foundation for Lockheed's future growth as various models of the airplane helped revolutionize commercial air transport in the 1930s. With his work on the design, Kelly Johnson became the sixth member of an engineering department in an industry which then couldn't afford specialists. Working often simultaneously as an aerodynamicist, stress analyst, weight, wind tunnel, and flight test engineer, he also put in long hours out in the shop, getting hands-on production experience and learning firsthand the importance of designing producibility into an airplane. It was a real-world education on all phases of design and development that within a decade couldn't be duplicated, and the lessons learned became guideposts for the rest of his career. He flew, for example, as flight test engineer on all models of the Electra, and worked for some of the most notable figures in aviation, such as Amelia Earhart. Out of this experience came his lifelong conviction the designer had to be able to test his own airplane. As he later commented,
I decided at an early stage that unless I had hell scared out of me once a year, I wouldn't have the proper balance to really design new airplanes of any type.
Kelly Johnson logged more than 2,300 hours as a flight test engineer. The versatile Electra spawned two major developments. One was the XC-35, a modified Model 10, which in 1937 first demonstrated the practical feasibility of transforming the entire fuselage into a pressurized cabin to permit comfortable high-altitude flight. Johnson was Lockheed's flight test engineer on this project, gaining first-hand experience with problems of pressurization, and more important, with tremendous possibilities pioneered by this aircraft. Possibilities to which he and Hal Hibbard began to give serious consideration. Meanwhile, the Model 14 Electra incorporated a number of Johnson innovations, such as the first practical application of Fowler flaps, which both increased the wing's lifting surface and served to permit slower, shorter distance landings, an achievement which won him the 1937 Lawrence Sperry Award. In 1938, the high speed and innovative features of the Model 14 attracted British interest in its potential as an anti-submarine patrol plane. But the requirements necessitated a major redesign. Johnson worked around the clock for 3 days, transformed the Model 14 into the Hudson bomber. The British ordered an initial batch of 250 aircraft, at that time the largest production order ever received by an American company. But there would be many more, 2,000 to the RAF alone, out of a total production run of nearly 3,000 airplanes. The Hudson put Lockheed into the big time. But even as production was gearing up, Kelly Johnson and his colleagues were well into other much more ambitious designs. The success of the pressurized XC-35 and the recognition that the next generation of air transports would be much larger, higher-speed, transoceanic aircraft inspired Johnson, Hibbard, and a small design team to lay out the now classic lines of the Model 49 Constellation in 1939. Using his soon-to-be legendary powers of persuasion, He convinced Lockheed to build its own wind tunnel, a decision that paid for itself many times over during the development of this design, as all aerodynamic problems were overcome early on, and not one external change had to be made to the actual aircraft. Hibbard was so impressed by Johnson's wizardry that he swore he could see air. Commercial development of the legendary Connie would be delayed by the war, and it first flew as the Army Air Force's C-69. This, however, provided time to refine the airplane so that at war's end, Lockheed was postured to capture a lion's share of the commercial market, and various models of the elegant Connie would continue to grace the world's airways into the late 1950s. At the time he laid down the basic design of the Constellation, Johnson was already well into another path-breaking project. In early 1937, responding to an Air Corps requirement for a high-altitude interceptor capable of 360 miles per hour, Johnson and Hibbard hastily conceived some possible configurations, depicted here in one of Kelly's rough sketches. As Johnson observed many times, in design, you're forced to develop unusual solutions to unusual problems. Their decision to go with an unconventional twin-boom configuration was dictated by another axiom. Design features are the creatures of necessity. The twin booms evolved as a logical development of engine nacelles which had to be extended to house the liquid-cooled engines, turbo superchargers, radiators, and main landing gear. It seemed logical, then, to simply extend the nacelles into booms which could carry the empennage. Their novel approach produced a winning design, and when the XB-38 was finally rolled out in January of 1939, its sleek lines bespoke speed. And when Lieutenant Ben Kelsey took it up for its maiden flight, it delivered an impressive 403 miles per hour, far exceeding the requirements. Thus began the saga of the P-38 Lightning. The first American aircraft able to fly at such speeds, it offered dazzling performance and a host of new problems. For as it peeled over into dives at high altitudes, it could hit speeds approaching 500 miles per hour. In this region, the aircraft began to violently shake and nose over into increasingly steeper angles, and control forces became so heavy pilots couldn't pull out. Tragically, some never recovered. Kelly Johnson wasn't taken by surprise. Although many insisted it was tail flutter, he immediately recognized it as the then little understood phenomenon of compressibility. At 500 miles per hour, localized airflow over certain parts of the aircraft was reaching supersonic velocity, and this produced shock waves and serious problems. The P-38 was the first aircraft to encounter this, and so little was actually known about it that Johnson launched exhaustive wind tunnel studies and an accelerated dive test program headed by Chief Test Pilot Milo Burcham. After more than 2 years, he finally identified the problem as shock stall on the wing, which reduced lift and increased drag, thereby inducing the nose-down tuck. Typically, he was quick to devise a cleverly simple remedy. A dive flap mounted to the main wing spar that, when deployed, generated a positive pressure field, immediately restoring lift and a nose-up pitching moment. Flown on every battlefield, the P-38 excelled in combat. Christened the fork-tailed devil by Germans, the versatile fighter, combining speed and load-carrying capability, proved adaptable to a wide array of combat roles, and its long legs made it ideal for the vast reaches of the Pacific, where it destroyed more enemy aircraft than any other Allied fighter. Impressive though it was, Kelly Johnson was never satisfied with it. He'd long foreseen the inherent limitations of prop-driven aircraft, and though unaware of developments in Germany and England, where turbojets had already been successfully developed, he decided that props had to go. Thus he and Hibbard became the first in this country to seriously pursue the possibilities of turbojet propulsion, when in 1939 they asked Nathan Price to design an experimental turbojet power plant. Design of the L-1000 got underway in 1940, and by 1942, Price had come up with a truly advanced design. a high compression ratio, twin spool, axial flow power plant promising an extraordinary 5,100 pounds of thrust. Meanwhile, Johnson and a young engineer named Willis Hawkins led a design team that came up with the L-133, a truly radical twin-engine stainless steel aircraft featuring thin wings and canard surfaces and projected to achieve 625 miles per hour at 50,000 feet. But surprisingly, when Johnson submitted a proposal for development of the engine and airframe in March 1942, the Army Air Forces showed little interest. Although launched long after his effort, top-secret development of an American turbojet fighter powered by a British Whittle engine was by then already underway. The Bell XP-59A first flew at Muroc Army Air Force Base on California's high desert in October of 1942, but it proved to be underpowered, overweight, and scarcely optimized for jet flight, and early on, the Army Air Forces decided that it wouldn't meet frontline fighter requirements, though Bell didn't yet know this, and the testing continued. On June 10, 1943, a Bell engineer at Muroc reported back that Johnson had been permitted to examine the still top-secret XP-59A, and he wondered what he was up to. Unbeknownst to Bell, the Army Air Force had already asked Lockheed to submit a proposal for a simpler, single-engine jet fighter built around a 3,000-pound thrust Halford H-1 engine, which would be capable of frontline service. Johnson took in a lot that day, but he'd already been wrestling with jet propulsion for nearly 3 years, and he already had a suitable design well in hand. When he made his proposal at Wright Field on June 18th, he made the astounding promise that he'd deliver an aircraft within just 180 days. Getting immediate approval, he was cautioned that the utmost secrecy was required. Lockheed was already swamped in terms of manpower, tooling, and facilities with wartime contracts. But this was a blessing in disguise, an opportunity to implement an idea he'd been pestering Robert Gross about for years. Let him round up a small group of talented people, designers, engineers, and shopmen, put them under one roof where they could all work closely together, and give him complete authority over everything from procurement to flight test. With no other options, Gross said, "Go ahead." Stealing people from around the plant, just 28 engineers, including himself, and 105 shopmen, he also built a small facility out of discarded shipping crates, using a circus tent for a roof. On June 19th, he laid down the principles under which the project would operate. In 1.5 pages, now preserved on old photostats, they formed the basis for how he'd try to operate for the next 30 years. He'd be responsible for all decisions. Paperwork and red tape would be cut to the minimum. Each engineer would be designer, shop contact, parts chaser, and mechanic, and each would remain within a stone's throw of the shop at all times. There'd be but one object to get a good airplane built on time. The daily log indicates that 2 days later, he laid out the horizontal structure of the organization. No pyramidal, multi-tiered layers of management. Each project engineer and the shop foreman would report directly to him. And in fact, he'd be looking over everyone's shoulder. He wanted information direct from the men doing the work. And if they had questions, they'd get decisions immediately on the spot. He'd promised the airplane in 180 days, as would become his custom. He gave his men 150. The clock started ticking on June 23rd. Forcefully reminded that simplicity is the keynote of good design, the designers jumped into their work. But this was a new kind of operation, and instead of moving from stage to stage, the schedule demanded an extraordinary degree of concurrency. With finished detailed design still many weeks away, the mock-up was started on June 30th and completed by July 17th. By then, milling and fabrication of parts and the construction of jigs to assemble a prototype was already well underway, and by July 31st, the bulkheads were going into the jigs. And section by section, the airframe started coming together. Throughout this period, however, the design process continued. As concurrent wind tunnel tests revealed problems, the wing and the engine air inlets were the biggest headaches. He'd gambled on the wing, a laminar flow airfoil that had never before been tested on an airplane. And of course, nobody had had any experience with inlets. Johnson was willing to accept mistakes on such an accelerated and risky venture, as long as they were reported promptly. Typically, he never asked why, but what are you going to do to fix it? The project was so secret that his group didn't even have a name. The whole setup reminded one of his design engineers, Herb Culber, of the mysterious place where Hairless Joe, one of Al Cap's cartoon characters in Little Abner, ground up skunks, old shoes, and other unsavory ingredients to brew a potent concoction called Kickapoo Joy Juice. So inspired, he answered the phone one day, "Skunk Works, Inside Man Culber." Though Johnson wasn't amused, his organization suddenly had a name that stuck. Remarkably, the completed aircraft arrived at Muroc on November 14th, just 143 days after startup. When the engine was run up 3 days later, there was a terrific roar as the inlet ducts collapsed, sending debris into the engine and cracking the impeller. It took 6 weeks to get a new engine, but on January 3rd, 1944, Milo Burcham successfully completed the taxi tests. And 5 days later, in the chill of the morning on January 8th, Johnson, in white coveralls, overcoat, and stocking cap, worked intently with his crew preparing for the first flight, as over 100 Skunk Works employees stood atop a hill looking on. He wanted everyone who'd worked on the airplane they now call Lulu Bell be on hand. He told Burcham, "Just fly her, Milo. Find out if she's a lady or a witch." 9:15, he took off. But only 5 minutes later, he was taxiing back to report that the landing gear hadn't retracted and that the boosted ailerons felt too sensitive. While the gear problem was being fixed, Johnson assured him that the control sensitivity was normal, and at 10 o'clock, he took off again, and this time put on a dazzling 20-minute display, attaining a top speed of 490 miles per hour and reporting a roll rate of 360 degrees per second. Back on the ground, he was able to report that Lulu Bell was indeed a lady. The XP-80 ultimately became the first American aircraft to exceed 500 miles per hour, but this was only the beginning. For months, Johnson had been working on a larger, more advanced version with a 4,000-pound thrust General Electric I-40 engine, promising much greater speed. He promised the XP-80A just 150 days and delivered it in 132. But as Tony LeVere taxied in after the first flight on June 10th, he'd had a few surprises. Center of gravity miscalculations had caused porpoising. A faulty pressurization valve had channeled 325-degree engine bleed air into the cockpit. And malfunctioning flaps put the airplane into violent rolls. Only his superb flying skills allowed him to bring it back, and Johnson was so grateful he doubled LeVere's bonus, a gesture pointing up the special relationship between them, and indeed between Kelly Johnson and all of his test pilots. Unlike so many of his peers, Johnson both understood and appreciated what his pilots did. He flew with them whenever possible, shared their concerns, always listened, and then acted on their recommendations. The XP-80A's problems were quickly remedied, and it went on to become the prototype for America's first operational jet fighter. Though it wouldn't enter combat in World War II, the P-80 Shooting Star would deliver awesome performance. In January of 1946, for example, Colonel William Council completed the first non-stop transcontinental jet flight covering 2,450 miles in a record 4 hours and 13 minutes, at an average speed of 580 miles per hour. In June of 1947, flying a specially modified P-80R, Colonel Albert Boyd completed 4 runs over a speed course at Muroc, averaging 623 miles per hour, and reclaiming the world speed record for the United States for the first time in 24 years. And over Korea in November of 1950, a shooting star put down a MiG-15 in history's first all-jet combat. And amply confirming Johnson's methods and his insistence on simplicity, the P-80 would give birth to a number of progeny. Shrewdly sensing the need for a jet trainer, Johnson gambled $1 million of Lockheed money on the development of an F-80C airframe into a 2-seat configuration, which after its first flight in March 1948 was transformed into the classic T-33, an airplane affectionately called the T-Bird, which would serve as the standard jet trainer for legions of student pilots around the world for the next 3 decades. In response to an urgent Air Force requirement for an interim all-weather interceptor, the T-33, in turn, served as the basis for 3 different models of the F-94 Starfire, which filled a critical void while newer designs specifically tailored for that role remained under development in the early 1950s. Not done yet, the now vintage design would realize its final incarnation as the T-2V1 Sea Star, an advanced, navalized version of the T-33. All of the iterations of the P-80 design were still yet to come, however, as in 1946, he started design work to meet an Air Force requirement for a new penetration escort fighter. Early on, he explored the possibility of applying new concepts, a delta wing, even in-flight variable wing sweep, and then discarded both, some of the more than 60 concepts he'd examine and reject. When the XF-90 finally rolled out, 3 years later, he was the victim of ever-changing and conflicting requirements, from a time to climb of 35,000 feet in 10 minutes to 50,000 in 5, 900-mile range to 1,500, and then back to 600, and finally ground attack capability in a high-speed, high-altitude design. This prompted him to build a brawny airframe, over 30,000 pounds fully loaded, and stressed for over 12 Gs. When Tony LeVere took off on early test flights, he had to use rocket assist because the pair of small 3,000-pound thrust J-34s still lacked afterburning capability. The usual post-flight congratulations and festivities belied the fact that Johnson knew he was facing terrible odds. With the same pair of inadequate engines as their principal rival, the McDonnell XF-88 got half again as heavy because the 88 hadn't been beefed up for ground attack. Johnson's airplane was bound to suffer performance-wise. It was overweight and underpowered, and even when afterburning was finally added, boosting combined thrust up to more than 8,000 pounds, its top speed in level flight was only 668 miles per hour, slower than existing operational F-86s. It achieved one distinction, however, when in April 1950, LeVere pushed over into a steep dive, and it became the first Lockheed airplane to exceed the speed of sound. With performance no better than the XF-90s, the McDonnell entry won the competition, but neither design went into production. The whole ordeal taught Johnson never again to take on a job unless the requirements were both well-defined and firm. Even though a failure, the XF-90 went on to demonstrate that he certainly knew how to build a rugged airframe, as in April 1952, it survived the first of a series of atomic blasts, suffering only 20 hours worth of repair work. Meanwhile, Johnson was completing work on a much more unconventional airplane. Designed to meet a Navy requirement for a vertical takeoff and landing, or VTOL fighter, the XF-B1 was supposed to claw its way straight up by means of huge contra-rotating props driven by a twin turbine power plant, providing more power than the airplane's weight. Engine development lagged, however, and after test pilot Herman Fish Salmon first lifted off from the lakebed at what was now called Edwards Air Force Base in December 1953. The underpowered XFV-1 continued to rely on its makeshift landing gear for all takeoffs and landings. Once aloft, however, Salmon was able to demonstrate that it could make satisfactory transitions from horizontal to vertical flight, and that it could hover in the vertical attitude. But lacking the promised power, explaining in his words that it's awful hard to fly an airplane looking over your shoulder, Salmon wasn't eager to attempt vertical liftoffs or touchdowns. Neither was Johnson, who, believing a designer shouldn't be afraid to fly his own airplane, had the integrity to recommend cancellation of the whole project. By that time, however, he already had a much more promising design on the ramp at Edwards. When Tony LeVere first saw it, he asked incredulously where the wings were. But those tiny, blade-thin wings and everything else about the XF-104 were actually the product of years of careful thought, effort, and Johnson's determination this time to employ his Skunk Works methods. Back in 1947, he'd modified a P-80 with wingtip-mounted ramjets, and with fish salmon at the controls, became the first piloted aircraft to fly on ramjet power alone. These tests supported a major Skunk Works type of effort to explore a whole new realm. At a time when missile and guidance system technologies were still in their infancy, Johnson's team had to design a pilotless Mach 3 testbed to further explore ramjet technology. The X-7 was the product of their efforts, and its tiny, thin, slightly tapered wings, Johnson's solution to the problems of high Mach flight, had been thoroughly tested on rockets and with scale models. The X-7 first flew in April 1951, and went on to a remarkable career. Launched from a B-29, boosted to high speed by powerful rockets, and then flying on various ramjets under test, it ultimately exceeded Mach 4 and climbed well above 100,000 feet. Thus those small, thin wings were already more than just a theory. Johnson visited the Korean battlefront in 1951. Still smarting from the XF-90, he'd gone there to talk to the ultimate customers, combat pilots, about what they wanted in a fighter. To a man, it was higher speed, more altitude, and less complexity. Intent on giving them just that, he made an unsolicited proposal to build a fighter for which no requirement yet existed. When he promised Mach 2 at 60,000 feet in a simple, lightweight fighter, Colonel Bruce Holloway stepped into the next room and within 2 hours returned with a short 1.5-page list of requirements. This time, the firm, straightforward requirement, Johnson returned to his favorite Skunk Works mode of operation, and less than a year later, February of 1954, Tony LeVere lifted the XF-104 from the lakebed for its first flight. Though configured with a much lower thrust engine than the powerful J-79 scheduled for the production model, the XF-104 was still faster than any other fighter in the world. But Johnson had produced more than just a dazzling performer. Fanatical about costs and producibility, while design of the prototypes was still underway, he'd set up a small group of engineers to find the cheapest and most efficient way to produce each part of the production airplane. An innovation which would result in savings of about $12,000 per aircraft and millions for his customers. When the press finally got to see the F-104, they called it the missile with a man in it, and they weren't far off the mark. The first Mach 2 operational aircraft in the world, it would go on to shatter every significant record on the books. 91,000 feet and 1,400 miles per hour in May of 1958, making it the first aircraft ever to hold both the world altitude and speed marks simultaneously. 3 time-to-climb records later that year. And in 1959, it became the first airplane taking off on its own power ever to climb above 100,000 feet, as Captain Joe Jordan zoomed up over 103,000 feet. This kind of performance clinched the 1958 Collier Trophy for Johnson. While the Starfighter was capturing headlines with record-breaking performances, another, much more exotic Johnson design was unbeknownst to all but a few, almost daily cruising in level flight at altitudes far beyond any official records. It had been born of the massive arms buildup of the early 50s, when U.S. intelligence agencies urgently needed confirmation of reports of major Soviet advances in intercontinental range bombers and ballistic missiles. The decision to proceed with overflights led to a design competition for a reconnaissance aircraft capable of 70,000 feet. While Lockheed hadn't been invited to participate, Johnson had caught wind of it and hastily submitted a proposal to build the CL-282, essentially a modified F-104 with a wide-span, high-aspect ratio wing. Though it lost out to the Bell X-16, Kelly Johnson wasn't about to quit. Over the years, he'd gotten to know a lot of people in high places, and he developed consummate lobbying skills. With a revised design and promising an airplane within just 8 months, he got the go-ahead to produce 20 aircraft for $22 million. The project, codenamed Aquatone, was directed by the CIA's Richard Bissell, who found the Skunk Works' streamlined, informal method of getting things done much to his liking. Secrecy limited access to a mere handful of CIA and Air Force personnel, which was fine with Johnson because it freed him from a lot of needless paperwork and interference. The urgency of the project also freed him from what he regarded as the tyranny of technical specifications. His customers simply wanted an airplane that could do the job, and all he had to do was deliver on time. While the article, as it was called, was a relatively conventional design, the extreme altitudes at which it was supposed to operate imposed severe demands. Forced to ruthlessly cut weight, he reduced structural components to the minimum and designed delicate, lighter-like wings spanning 80 feet, weighing less than 4 pounds per square foot. The fragile airframe was designed to run a special high-altitude version of the J-57 engine, virtually hand-built to extremely high tolerances and originally producing 10,500 pounds of thrust. When the disassembled aircraft was unloaded from a C-124 at a remote desert test site in July of 1955, Johnson had met yet another seemingly impossible deadline. After reassembly, it was rolled out into daylight for the first time, painstakingly prepared for its taxi tests. On August 1st, as he had so many times in the past, Tony LeVere climbed into the cockpit. During his third run that day, he suddenly noticed that he was more than 30 feet off the ground. Coming down hard, the tires blew and the brakes failed and caught fire. Reporting afterwards, he explained that at 70 knots, I became aware of being airborne, which left me with utter amazement, as I had no intentions whatsoever of flying. Those fragile wings had more than enough lift. He completed the first real flight 4 days later, and on a subsequent flight reported that the aircraft climbed toward the heavens like a homesick angel. To conceal its true purpose, the Angel was given the misleading official designation U-2, and a cover story was released to the effect that it was being developed as a high-altitude research vehicle for the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. While it would perform this role admirably, tests focused on preparing the U-2 for its real mission, carry 700 pounds of high-resolution camera equipment up to altitudes then beyond any air defense capabilities. And in July 1956, just 11 months after first flight, it commenced its clandestine operational career. Climbing to well above 70,000 feet as fuel burned off, U-2 successfully completed flights over denied areas and brought back the first hard data on the status of Soviet military preparedness and the true extent of its intercontinental ballistic missile program. Called the Dragon Lady by its pilots because it reminded them of the beautiful, mysterious, and sometimes treacherous character in the Terry and the Pirates cartoon strip. It flew with virtual impunity for 4 years, until that day, in May of 1960, Francis Gary Powers was shot down by a surface-to-air missile. While deep penetration of Soviet airspace came to a halt, the U-2 continued to overfly hotspots around the world, such as in 1962, when it confirmed the existence of missile launch sites in Cuba. And it would also continue to perform an incredibly wide array of extremely high-altitude research missions. Billy Johnson had reason to be proud of his Angel. The Skunk Works had finally been formally established as Lockheed Advanced Development Projects, and on this, its first production program, he'd refunded $2 million from the original $22 million contract and built an additional 5 airplanes out of spare parts. Surely one of the best bargains in defense procurement history. That pride was rekindled when in 1981, the larger, more sophisticated TR-1 was rolled out years after U-2 production had ended. It was the first time the Air Force had ever put an aircraft back into production. And it remains to this day the highest flying single-engine piloted aircraft in the world. Back in December of 1956, the Skunk Works' remarkable performance on the U-2 had convinced Lockheed to give Johnson the job of designing and developing prototypes for a small military jet transport. Dollars were scarce, competition keen, and he'd only have 8 months to do the job. Being on time had always been one of his cardinal rules, and in just 241 days, he delivered the Jetstar. He'd actually been working on designs for a large jet transport since 1944. This trim little craft was actually a scaled-down version of the L-193, an innovative 1953 design which the airlines had feared too risky to support. Johnson, who continued to put in long hours as a flight test engineer on this project, was out to prove them wrong. And he was more than pleased with the results. A top speed of over 600 miles per hour, a peak altitude of 52,000 feet, and with wing tanks, a range of over 3,000 miles. The Jetstar easily won the competition, and though only a limited number went into military service as C-140s, ultimately more than 200 were produced. The Jetstar was a pleasant diversion as he worked on another, much tougher project. Even as development of the U-2 was still underway, he'd projected that air defenses would catch up with it within 2 years, and he'd initiated a remarkable series of design studies for a liquid hydrogen-fueled supersonic successor capable of climbing above 90,000 feet. Performance varied from Mach 2.5 and a range of 2,200 miles to Mach 4 and 9,000 miles. Because of the extremely low volumetric density of liquid hydrogen, however, the latter speed and range capability could only be achieved by building an airframe twice the size of a B-52. That was far too costly, and thus a much smaller design at the lower end of the performance spectrum went into development as the CL-400 in 1956. Though the CL-400 proved the technical feasibility of a liquid hydrogen-powered aircraft, Johnson was dissatisfied with its short range and convinced that the problems of producing and transporting fuel around the world were insurmountable. Refusing to build an airplane he didn't believe in, he recommended cancellation of the project in 1957. But he had an ace up his sleeve. As concurrent with the liquid hydrogen studies, he'd also examined the potential of another advanced design, using jet fuel, which at some loss in altitude promised Mach 3 cruise and 4,000-mile range. It was the genesis of his most spectacular creation. Given approval to proceed, in April of 1958, Johnson began a series of design studies, unveiled publicly here for the first time, for what he initially called the U-3, and then the Archangel, because it would soar much higher than the U-2. He explored various means by which he could get the vehicle to altitudes as high as 150,000 feet, employing a variety, or even a combination of rocket, ramjet, and turbojet power plants. At one point, he looked at the use of balloons to lift it to its rocket boost phase, and then at using a modified U-2 to tow a ramjet vehicle to 60,000 feet for engine ignition. He even considered a multi-staged vehicle, and one with inflatable wings and empennage. And throughout, he was challenged by the urgent need to reduce radar cross-section. For the first time, stealth would have to be designed into the airplane. The intense design gestation process was completed in just 16 months, and when he presented his 12th concept to the CIA and Air Force in August 1959, he got the go-ahead. When the stunningly beautiful A-12 was finally rolled out for its initial tests in April 1962, it wasn't some fantastic, multi-staged aberration. It was an honest airplane, but nothing like it had ever been built before. Ironically codenamed Oxcart and designed for sustained Mach 3.2 cruise at altitudes between 75 and 95,000 feet, it posed by far the greatest challenge of Johnson's career, as everything from structural materials to hydraulic fluid and fuels had to be invented from scratch. For example, because of the intense heat at sustained Mach 3 speeds, averaging more than 550 degrees on the surface of the airplane, Johnson employed a titanium alloy for more than 90% of the airframe. But no one had ever before attempted to process such quantities of the extremely hard metal to the purity and strength levels required. Thus, new forging and milling processes had to be invented and perfected. When the thin titanium skin on a wing panel shriveled up during heating tests, Johnson separated the panels from the wing spars with extrusions and put the now famous corrugations in the skin. When heated thereafter, the corrugations merely deepened a few thousandths of an inch and on cooling returned to their original shape. Common sense solution to a difficult problem. There were literally thousands of such problems to overcome, and as always, Johnson stayed on top of all of them, looking over people's shoulders, asking lots of questions, always the best way, in his view, to get people to solve problems. And he continued to amaze everyone with, for example, on-the-spot predictions of skin temperatures, which after hours of calculation, they'd find were within 1 or 2 degrees of the exact figure. The whole effort, completed in absolute secrecy with an incredibly small group of people, was all the more remarkable because it was done without the benefit of computers. As Johnson later recalled,
when you think back to 1958, when the basic design work on the prototypes for this airplane was being designed and built, we had to make use of the Michigan computer, which is a 12-inch slide rule, and it did its job quite well.
All of this prodigious effort was about to come to fruition when on April 25, 1962, preparations for high-speed taxi and an initial brief liftoff were completed. But as Lou Schock sped down the runway, he encountered nose-wheel steering problems and had to kick in heavy right rudder. Then, as Johnson wrote in his log, the aircraft got off the ground. There was an immediate change of rudder angle. This set up lateral oscillations which were horrible to see. Schock was lucky to get the airplane back on the ground. The problem was fixed post-haste, and the next day, he completed the first unofficial flight with the gear down. On April 30th, Johnson was back with an entourage of VIPs for the official first flight. Looking like he didn't have a care in the world, he offered a few last words of encouragement and advice before Schock taxied out. And from there, everything went flawlessly. "59 minutes later, Schock was back on the ground, welcomed by an elated Kelly Johnson. and the small, awestruck assembly just witnessed something very special. Limited by interim J-75 engines, the A-12 didn't begin to realize its full potential until after the Pratt & Whitney J-58s, for which it was designed, finally arrived in January 1963. At 32,500 pounds of thrust, the J-58 was every bit as exotic as the airplane itself. In combination with an extremely complex inlet and exhaust ejector system, it operated as a normal afterburning turbojet up to speeds of about 1,600 miles per hour, and then shifted to bleed bypass cycle, with the inlet actually providing most of the thrust at Mach 3 cruise. When a two-seat trainer became available in early 1963, Johnson, true to his convictions about flying his own aircraft, jumped into the rear cockpit, and, taking control after climb-out, he'd fly supersonic, first time in his life. During the course of the test program, a pair of airframes were modified for a highly unconventional mission. In 1964, the Skunk Works built a small, 42-foot-long airframe with the very same materials used on the A-12. Designed to overfly areas deemed too risky for air crews, the D-21 drone would ride piggyback atop an A-12 for Mach 3 launches at 80,000 feet. And powered by a ramjet originally developed during the X-7 program, it would be even faster than the A-12. The finished article was mounted to its mothership, now designated M-12, December 1964. And on December 22nd, the unusual pair taxied for the first time, and flight tests got underway. After takeoff on launch missions, the M-12 climbed to a rendezvous with a KC-135 for refueling, and then proceeded on to the predetermined launch point, where the backseater would monitor the systems and initiate the launch procedures. While there were several successful tests, it was always a very risky business at best, and Kelly Johnson personally canceled this program after a fatal mid-air collision in 1966. By then, however, he already had two other very successful ox-cart progeny off the ground. The first was the YF-12A, prototype for a proposed high-speed interceptor. It was this aircraft which went on public display when in 1964, President Lyndon Johnson announced the existence of the A-11. And it subsequently put on a dazzling show, as in May 1965, it claimed no less than 9 world records, including a top speed of more than 2,000 miles per hour and a sustained altitude of over 80,000 feet without in any way taxing its full potential. The YF-12 was equipped with an advanced ASG-18 Doppler radar system and configured to carry 3 AIM-47 missiles internally. Though missiles had never before been launched within the YF-12's speed and altitude regime, the aircraft and its systems scored a reported 90% kill rate, even against drones flying head-on down on the deck at distances of 120 miles and more. The Air Force was impressed enough to order 93 of the big fighters into production for the Air Defense Command. The budgetary constraints ultimately resulted in their cancellation. The A-12 was also removed from service, leaving only the Air Force's SR-71, which took over its reconnaissance mission. Though everything about it and its activities would remain cloaked in a heavy shroud of secrecy, this was the aircraft that everyone came to know as the Blackbird. A solid coat of black paint, which seemed to add to its allure and mystery, actually had a very practical purpose. It reduced skin temperatures by about 75 degrees. Its clean, elegant lines, the smooth contours of its blended wing-body shape, give the impression that an artist had sculpted it into a rare work of art. In aircraft design, however, More than any other field, form follows function. And here again, every line, every detail of the airplane exists only to serve some practical purpose. The chines, for example, which extend from the wing to the nose and flow gracefully up into the fuselage, actually satisfied a number of requirements. Aerodynamically, they reduced drag and added lift while also enhancing the stability of the aircraft. The SR-71's mission was long-range reconnaissance, and its fuselage was essentially a big fuel tank. Thus, the chines also served to house its sophisticated cameras and sensors. Finally, those sloping contours extending up from the chines enhanced the airplane's survivability by reducing its radar cross-section. Thus, while an artist might envy its striking beauty, an engineer would only marvel at the logical genius of its design. That genius was recognized when, in 1964, Kelly Johnson became the first person ever to be awarded a second Collier Trophy. The SR-71 went on to claim the world absolute speed and altitude records, and then repeatedly extended them. And to the public, it always remained Kelly Johnson's mysterious, record-breaking Blackbird. The crews who flew it, however, had another name for it. Throughout its long operational career, it remained invincible and incredibly effective. And to its crews, it was Habu, dark-skinned pit viper with a deadly bite. And though it was finally retired from Air Force service in 1990, Kelly Johnson's Mach 3 masterpiece is still charting the future, its crews still looking up toward the blue-black void of space, flying exotic research missions for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. When he retired in 1975, Kelly Johnson had been on the cutting edge of an advance from 200 to more than 2,000 miles per hour. He'd been involved in the design of 44 different airplanes, many of them among the classics of aviation history. And at the time, he was still looking very much into the future. He'd gotten the Skunk Works into a project which would bear fruit in the F-117A, world's first true stealth aircraft. And he'd left a legacy which would leave its mark on the future. It seems kind of ironic that a lowly creature, known primarily for its odoriferous emanations, had, by the time Kelly retired, become a universal symbol for excellence. He had a remarkable capacity to take a complex problem, reduce it to its simplest components, and then take the most direct and sensible approach to its solution. Always a maverick, he was smart enough and tough enough not to follow the committee rule of conventional wisdom. This gave him remarkable freedom. With that freedom came a tremendous burden of responsibility. Finally, and most important, he understood himself well enough to realize that with few good people, he can do remarkable things. Kelly Johnson's greatest legacy wasn't just what he did, but the way he did it. A parched and forbidding wasteland to those who've journeyed through it over the years, the western Mojave is a harsh, inhospitable land of sometimes stunning contrasts. A land of bone-chilling nights and griddle-hot days, of violent dust storms and mesmerizing sunsets. The primitive landscape is dominated by one truly remarkable feature. When she first gazed upon it early in this century, homesteader Jeanette Darr said of it, "I thought it was the jumping-off place of creation."